I see the senator from Montana, and I'd be happy to entertain a question without losing the floor.
Will the senator from Kentucky yield for a question without losing his right to the floor?
Yes.
I want to thank my colleague for raising this important issue on the Senate floor today. You know, it wasn't all that long ago that as a House member, I served one term in the House and then came over to the Senate this year. I came over to the Senate floor and I stood in support of your efforts to protect the American civil liberties and ensure that drones aren't being used to target American citizens on our own soil. And in fact, I'm grateful to see that in the Senate chamber today, we have 5 House members who are here standing with the senator from Kentucky as he's making this very, very important point. It relates to our Constitution and our freedom. Well, 2 years later, we're here again, and the threats to America's civil liberties and constitutional freedoms remain ever present. As my colleague from Kentucky is well aware, I spent more than 12 years in the technology sector before being elected to Congress. I know firsthand the power that big data holds. I also know the great risks that arise when this power is abused. There is a clear and a direct threat to American civil liberties that comes from the mass collection of our personal information and our phone records. I, like so many Montanans, are deeply concerned about the NSA's bulk metadata collection program and its impact on our constitutional rights. In fact, just last night, I hosted a telephone town hall meeting with thousands and thousands of Montanans. And one of the issues I heard most about was the NSA's bulk data collection program. And when is Congress finally going to put a stop to it? In fact, this is one of the issues I hear most about from my fellow Montanans. In fact, I've brought down just a few of the thousands of letters I've received from Montanans on the NSA's dangerous bulk metadata collection program. For example, here's Adam from Missoula. Adam writes, "I'm writing to ask you to allow Section 215 of the Patriot Act to expire on June 1st of this year. While it's only one provision of the larger problem, it would at least begin to curtail the surveillance of Americans. As Americans, we should be free to communicate without the threat of the government monitoring those communications. Wanting to hide your life, to keep your life private, does not mean you have something to hide. Only that your life isn't any of the government's business as long as you're not infringing on the liberty of others. At the end of the day, giving up our liberties because of the threat of terrorism truly is the definition of terrorism winning. To be free inherently means a person also incurs risk." Even though he was speaking about taxes, I believe Benjamin Franklin would agree when he said, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." Jess from my hometown of Bozeman, Montana, wrote this, "I am writing to you as your constituent. NSA spying needs a comprehensive overhaul. But in the meantime, I urge you to show that you care about the Constitution by voting against reauthorization of Section 215 of the u.s.a. Patriot Act. Section 215 has been used to invade the privacy of millions of people. Although some in Congress and the NSA have argued that collecting call detail records, quote, metadata, is not privacy invasion, the information collected by the government is not just metadata. It paints an intimate portrait of the lives of millions of Americans. What's more, the collection of call detail records isn't even necessary to keep us safe. The President, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and the President's Review Group have all admitted that collection of call detail records is not necessary. In fact, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board went so far as to note that it could not identify a single time in which bulk collection under Section 215 made a concrete difference in the outcome of a counterterrorism investigation. That's why I urge you to support reform by committing to a no vote on the reauthorization of Section 215. A vote against reauthorization is a vote for the Constitution. Thank you for opposing unconstitutional surveillance and for supporting a free and secure internet. You know, Montanans are right to be concerned. This program is a direct threat to our constitutional rights. It has jeopardized our civil liberties with little proven effectiveness. And I'm the son of a U.S. Marine. Several weeks ago, I was with Leader McConnell and other senators. When we went to Israel, we met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We went to Jordan and met with King Abdullah. We went to Iraq and met with Prime Minister Abadi. We were both in Baghdad. We went up to Erbil and met with the leaders of the Kurds, including Mr. Barzani. We then went to Afghanistan. We were in Kabul. We were in Jalalabad. We met with President Ghani. We were hearing directly from the leaders in the Middle East. We were hearing directly from our U.S. military. We were hearing directly from U.S. intelligence about what's going on in the Middle East. As a father of four, someone who believes strongly in a strong national defense and the importance of protecting the homeland, I weigh these issues very, very deeply. These are heavy issues we must look at as we want to ensure we protect the homeland, but importantly, protect the Constitution and the constitutional rights of the American people. As my colleague is likely aware, a 2014 report from the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is a nonpartisan, independent privacy board, found that the NSA's bulk data collection program, and I quote, said contributed only minimal value in combating terrorism beyond what the government already achieves through other alternative means. And like the New York-based Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals recently unanimously confirmed, this oversight board also found that Section 215 of the Patriot Act does not provide authority for the NSA's bulk metadata collection program. In fact, the report states, and I quote, under the Section 215 bulk telephone records program, the NSA acquires a massive number of calling records from telephone companies each day, potentially including the records of every call made across the nation. Yet Section 215 does not authorize the NSA to acquire anything at all. It's illegal. It's an overreach of power. And it's a direct threat to our First and Fourth Amendment rights. In fact, the report goes on to conclude, and I quote, the program lacks a viable legal foundation under Section 215. It implicates constitutional concerns under the First and Fourth Amendments. It raises serious threats to privacy and civil liberties as a policy matter, and has shown only limited value. For these reasons, the government should end the program, end quote. I stand here today with the people of Montana. I stand here today with my colleague from Kentucky. I stand here today with 5 members of the U.S. House who are seated in the back of the Senate chamber. Congressman Duncan of South Carolina, Congressman Blum of Iowa, Congressman Massey of Kentucky, Congressman Labrador of Idaho, Congressman Amash of Michigan. You know, I think it's important that the Senate recognizes what the People's House did last week when they passed the u.s.a. Freedom Act. That vote was 338 to 88. And to suggest that this is just a small minority of congressmen and women that support the u.s.a. Freedom Act, this was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, the chairman of the Armed Services, the chairman of Homeland Security, amongst many others who want to ensure we strike the right balance between protecting the homeland and protecting our civil liberties. The people of Montana, my colleague from Kentucky, the 5 members of Congress who are here at this moment, and millions of Americans know that I strongly agree with their view on the USA Freedom Act. Now, like all Americans, I understand the great risks facing our national security. The threats of ISIS, the threats of North Korea, the threats of Iran grow stronger each and every day. And we must be prepared. And we must ensure our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have the tools they need to protect and defend our nation. But these objectives, national security and protection of our civil liberties, are not mutually exclusive. We can and we must achieve both. We must maintain a balance between protecting our nation's security while also maintaining our civil liberties and our constitutional rights. All of us standing here today took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I took that oath just a few steps away from speaking here today between myself and the presiding chair of the U.S. Senate, Senator Mike Lee. And all of us here today know the fight to protect our Constitution and American civil liberties is far from over. We must remain vigilant, and we must also ensure that we have robust and transparent debate about these programs and what reforms must be implemented to protect America's civil liberties. And this is why I support the USA Freedom Act, which would end the NSA's bulk metadata collection program, and why I strongly believe that Congress must engage in an open amendment process. The American people must have their voices heard, and an open amendment process will help ensure that happens. In light of all we have learned about the NSA's unlawful bulk data collection program, it's clear that reforms must happen. It's critical that Americans' rights are protected against the overreach of their own government. So I asked the senator from Kentucky, would he agree that the indiscriminate government collection of Americans' phone records violates the Constitution and, according to 2 independent commissions, has not proven critical to our national security?
I want to thank the senator from Montana for that excellent synopsis of things and also for the great question. I think that the reports by the Review Committee and the Privacy Committee, both commissioned by the President, both nonpartisan, are incredibly powerful. Because not only did they look at the constitutional issues of whether or not this is a bulk or a general warrant versus an individual warrant, they also looked practically, was it working? Was it adding anything to our intelligence? And so I think you have sort of a dual reason now to say this is a big problem. One, there are constitutional questions, which I think are very clear, but then there's a second practical question that when you examine the evidence, and the Privacy Commission actually looked at classified evidence, they looked to see whether or not it was adding anything to this. I'm thoroughly convinced that we can catch terrorists with warrants. When I've talked with traditional constitutional warrants, when I've talked to those who are the high-ranking former heads of our security, they freely admit they get more information with a warrant. It's a little more work, but it has to be more specific. But I'm also a believer that because we've generalized what we're looking for and it's indiscriminate, that maybe we're missing people because we're overwhelmed with data and we're overwhelmed with things at the airports. You know, I would much prefer to have less of the indiscriminate searches at airports and more specific looking at the manifest of who's flying, you know, and looking and trying to find who are at risk. So I do think that there's, without question, this is not a constitutional program. It's not even legal under the Patriot Act. The courts have said it isn't, and we should do everything we can to stop it. And I appreciate your support on that. One of the things about this issue is that it really is a bipartisan issue, and an issue where there are people who feel strongly on both sides of the aisle. We had the senator from Oregon earlier and the senator from New Mexico, and I now see the senator from West Virginia, who is also a loud and consistent voice on this. Do you have a question?
Mr. President, will the senator from Kentucky yield?
The gentleman yield.
Without yielding the floor.
You know, I know that the senator, my friend from Kentucky, agrees with me that the defense of our country and the protection of our civil liberties should be bipartisan and above politics. And I know that he agrees that we can and must protect our citizens without violating their civil liberties. And again, my good friend, I don't always agree with you on every issue, but when it comes to this nation's intelligence gathering and security, we agree more than we don't. Like him, I was deeply troubled by the revelation that our country was engaged in bulk collection. I think we all were surprised. And millions of private citizens' data was gathered unknowingly and unjustifiably. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed to the American public that the NSA was engaging in the bulk data collection and sweeping up virtually every cell phone record of an enormous number of Americans, again for no reason and no cause. The U.S. spying program did this by systematically and indiscriminately collecting millions, I mean millions of American phone records by simply taking up every phone record that came in its net, even if it wasn't remotely related to the broad general search. These are not searches that were relevant to a particular thread or an individual group. It was just a huge database documenting what millions of law-abiding citizens were doing. That is not what this country was based on, and I think you've made that very clear, sir. And I know that you believe that this was wrong, as I do. And that is not just our opinion. National security experts, legal experts, the American public, and even several courts have said that the bulk collection of data is not only unconstitutional, but also unnecessary to our national security. And to my friend from Kentucky, he has confirmed that the President's Review Group has said the bulk data collection is not essential to preventing attacks, and that program has not made a difference in a single instance. The bill that the Senate will soon be considering, the u.s.a. Freedom Act of 2015, will ensure that we restore important privacy protections for Americans. The United States will always face security threats. I think we all know that, and for generations to come. That's just a reality. On that horrible day, September 11, 2001, we as a country were reminded of this fact and realized we must meet those threats with strong law enforcement and strong intelligence. However, we must also balance that necessity with our constitutional rights. The NSA bulk data collection program clearly did not strike that balance, and the District Court of D.C. and the Court of Appeals of the Second Circuit of the United States struck it down. The courts have made clear this program is not legal, and I understand Senator Paul and Senator Wyden's frustration with any suggestion that it be continued. I believe this bill, u.s.a. Freedom 2015, moves us in a positive direction. It ends the bulk data collection program and ensures that the collection of data is related to a relevant, particular terrorist investigation. At the same time, it still protects this country. The u.s.a. Freedom Act of 2015 replaces indiscriminate bulk collection and allows the government to collect call details of records on a daily basis if it can demonstrate to the FISA court a reasonable, articulate suspicion that its search term is associated with a foreign terrorist organization. The bill provides greater transparency about surveillance activities. It contains significant new government reporting requirements for FISA authorities to ensure its activities do not again break the law. It gives private companies increased options for reporting to the public information about the number of FISA orders and national security letters that they receive. The bill requires declassification of FISA court opinions containing significant legal interpretations. The bill requires the FISA court to designate a panel to appoint individuals to advise in particular cases involving new or difficult legal issues. It expands the opportunity for the appellate review of FISA court decisions. The bill strengthens the judicial review process for gag orders. It imposes new privacy protections for FISA pen registers and limits the use of unlawfully obtained information. And the bill also contains many provisions to protect our nation's security. It creates a new emergency authority to allow the government to obtain business records, including call detail records, without advance court authorization if an emergency requires those records. It also adds a short-term emergency authority for continued transnational surveillance of foreign terrorists or spies who come into the United States before emergency authorization can be obtained from the Attorney General. It permits ongoing FISA surveillance of an agent of foreign power who temporarily leaves the United States. It clarifies that individuals can be subject to FISA surveillance if they are knowingly aiding, abetting, or conspiring with respect to the proliferation of WMD on behalf of a foreign power. And finally, the bill increases the statutory maximum penalty for material support of terrorism from 15 to 20 years. Now, I know the senator from Kentucky does not think it goes far enough in protecting our privacy rights, but perhaps my good friend can remind us again on what provisions that you would like to see changed or strengthened in the bill to satisfy your interest and maybe Senator Wyden's interest and other people. I would yield the floor back to the senator from Kentucky to hear basically his concerns of how we can have some protections, and do we have any rights whatsoever to gather information when it's proven. I've heard you say that you thought if we could prove it, there was a definite concern that we had, you can get FISA courts and basically move forward from there. I thought this bill moved us in a positive direction. The new bill we're considering, or about to consider, sir, if you could explain to me maybe your concerns about that or what we need to do.
Let me make sure I have the question correct. Your question is on the USA Freedom, my concerns on the USA Freedom?
USA Freedom 2015.
Yeah. I want to like it, and I want to because it ends bulk collection, and I'm all for ending bulk collection. So we all agree. The people for it agree with the problem. It's a question of whether it's a solution. It says that there have to be specific selector terms on U.S. persons. Part of my problem is that persons is still defined as corporations. My concern is that you could put the word Verizon in there and the government wouldn't be collecting the records, but you still could get all the records from Verizon. You see what I mean? Because that's one of my concerns in the way it's been written. And my other general concern is that would we still be having bulk collection therefore, but it wouldn't be all done by the government, but it'd still be bulk collection through the phone companies. And I don't like the liability protection because I think it makes it more likely than not that your privacy agreement won't be as respected if they cannot be sued for violating your privacy agreement. Those are a couple of concerns. I don't know if they're insurmountable, but those are a couple concerns.
I think we both agree. I think mostly everybody in this body agrees that the bulk collections were wrong. They were proven to be illegal and should not have been done and should be stopped. I think we're all in agreement to that. We still know that we face considerable threats from around the world on a daily basis, if not even greater than that. And we were looking for trying to find the balance, and I think that you are valuable in helping us find that balance. I really do. And that's what we're looking for. And I know that your colleague, Senator, and my colleague, Senator Lee from Utah, has made a gallant effort trying to find that balance and making sure that we didn't overstep. The private companies are collecting. They already have that information anyway. It's not just sweeping from NSA as they had been doing. And basically, I'm understanding by this bill, the 2015 USA Freedom Act, where basically we'd have to demonstrate to the FISA court reasonable, articulate suspicion that its search term is associated with a foreign terrorist organization. They can't even go into those records until that's shown. That's the way I understood it. I'm not sure if there's something I'm missing.
Yeah, I guess the question I have is that we had some of those restrictions now, but they seem to think that those restrictions don't apply to collect. You know what I mean? The people interpreting what we have now are interpreting 215 to mean we can collect all the American records in bulk. If there were a way that I was necessary to pass USA Freedom and it were that close, if people were willing to look at the bill and say, we would make a person an individual. See, the big thing for me is that a warrant should be individualized. And I'm worried that when you use the word person, if it can be replaced with the word Verizon, and we could still collect all the records, I would feel really disappointed if we thought we got rid of bulk collection, and then a year or two from now, when they finally admit it, they'll admit, oh, we're still doing the same thing. We're doing Verizon, and we're getting all of Verizon's record. We're just making them process it, and we're paying them for it. That's my fear, is I want to make sure that doesn't happen.
I guess we're caught in that Citizens United decision, it sounds like.
In a different way. But I mean, we are talking about whether or not in the intelligence selector numbers, whether or not a person is a corporation and whether or not you can have a single warrant. See, I think if you want phone records from Verizon, it would say Verizon and we want the records of John Doe. It shouldn't just say we want all the records from Verizon. That to me is a general warrant. I'm still fearful that the USA Freedom Act may not limit that.
If there's a Freedom Act as it goes away, okay, the way that they've been doing bulk collection, which we agree should be done away with, and we don't come to some agreement, are you concerned that we might be in more jeopardy by not having something in place to where we're able to get the necessary intelligence we need?
And I guess that's where I also probably differ. I think we are just as safe or safer with nothing, because the Constitution allows the searching of records, and I'm all for it, but I would do it through warrants. And here's the thing is data, metadata, you can do a hop or two with these less than constitutional warrants or whatever, but with a real warrant, you can go 100 hops into the data. So I really would chase the rabbit down the hole. I mean, I really would look very hard with suspicion, and I think warrants are generally easy to get. This is a point that I don't get about why we have to have warrants that have a lower constitutional standard, because I think that the FISA warrants are almost never turned down, but neither are criminal warrants. If you are a policeman standing in front of a house, you almost never get a no, you know? But if you're a policeman and you say, I want to search all my neighbors' houses, judge is going to say no. And that's a good thing, you know? So I think traditional warrants, I think people have somehow just convinced themselves we can't catch terrorists with traditional warrants, but I think you can go through a lot of data with traditional warrants too.
Basically, that if it sunsets, the bulk collection, the way the Patriot Act has been enforced before, sunsets and it goes away, which we agree. We were trying to replace that before the sunset. You believe the system that we have in place today, I mean the system we've had in place before the Patriot Act of 2001, gives us still the ability to keep the homeland safe using the court system, as you say, follow the rabbit down the hole, using the court system. Let me say because we know we have rapid fire coming at us from different directions and people trying to come into this country and do harm. The social media has blown up since even 2001, so we're much more vulnerable from that standpoint. And what I'm hearing say also, you're not really objectionable, and if you can find the right language in that freedom, if you thought that you could get to that protection of that individual without the interpretation of the entire broadness of the corporations.
Right. I think that also within the context of we have 6 or 7 amendments that we'd like to introduce. Can't guarantee that we can win any of them, but there's a chance maybe we could win another reform. So for example, one of the reforms that some people think may be as important as all of the bulk collection is the ability of the government to tell an internet provider that they have to create a backdoor to their product for the government to go through, and some of the backdoor stuff through 702. We think there are some other things that may well be as big as this. I also think that there is the ability of the government not only to use traditional warrants, they have some they're using under executive order as well as we still have, you know, a host of other types of warrants and subpoenas being used. But I would never be for this in a heartbeat if I thought it was going to make the country endangered. I think we'll be safer because of it, and so will our liberty.
The good point of the bill that we will be considering, which is the 2015 Freedom Act bill, it expands the opportunity for the appellate review of the FISA court decisions, which I think you've had a problem with too, because it's been handed out uncontested, correct?
Say that again, please.
The appellate review, the bill that we will be considering is expanding the opportunity for the appellate review of FISA court decisions, which I think and I can understand, you're saying they can get a FISA order no matter what.
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I do believe that the court case right now, the way it stands, if the USA Freedom had passed last year, I think there's a chance it might have made the court case moot because it would have said, oh, Congress has already acted, and Congress now has given an authority for a variation of this, and Congress already fixed the problem. So there's part of me that would like to see the appellate court case go up to the Supreme Court. It's been remanded to a lower court, so I don't know if it's ever getting there. But we ultimately have some questions in our country that won't be decided till we have a Supreme Court case. And one of those questions is, do papers have to be physical and in your house? What if they're digital and lodged somewhere else? Do you have any right of privacy, any Fourth Amendment protection at all for records that are held somewhere else? The current legal opinion doesn't really give any protection to third-party records. I think that needs to be fixed, because I think technology has made it such that our records are no longer going to be real records that you can hold in your hand. I think almost all of our records are going to be virtual and held in space somewhere, and I think you have to still have a personal privacy protection in those.
So the bill that we have proposed before us, it's going to require declassification of FISA court opinions containing significant legal interpretation, which is positive thing.
There's a lot that I like in the bill. It's just a matter of whether or not I can be convinced that it doesn't allow bulk collection under another name. I'm still worried about that, but I'm open to it. And see, some of these things, this is a very important bill. I mean, we could have a week's discussion on this bill, and amendments, and a process. And the only reason we're getting a little bit of this is because I'm kind of forcing the issue. But I'd like to see the amendments voted on. And all the other stuff we're doing around here is important, but has no deadline. We could have done it next week, 2 weeks from now, all the stuff we're doing right now. So, but anyway, that's what I'm going to be asking for, is the ability to present 5 or 6 amendments, vote on them, and then we'll see. And I'm more than willing to talk with the authors of the U.S.A. Freedom Act to see if there's a way, but it's going to have to involve maybe some give and take to figure it out.
Well, it sounds like we're not that far apart. I think that we're all going down the same path, trying to find a way to keep the homeland as secure as humanly possible, but protecting the rights of all Americans, and I appreciate that, and I hope that we do. These are important issues, and it's a dangerous world we live in. It's a threatened world that our children are being raised in, and we want to do everything we can to protect them. I know you do too. With that, I think we all come to an agreement that what was done before was wrong. So we all have come unanimously to that agreement. Finding the pathway forward is the one we're working on now. So I appreciate your in sincerity and intent to try to reach out and find that, and I hope that you can find that comfort level that we can move forward and still have a protected country. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Relevant sort of means that there's some kind of criteria that says these records have some pertinence. There's something about these records. There's something about this investigation. Like, for example, you know, someone in the northwest section of Washington, D.C., and we saw something happen there. We're saying we want to look at the records there. Even though it might be bulk collection, it would be at least relevant to some sort of investigation. There would be some pertinent factor. But they're not electing any, they're just collecting everybody's records. It's completely without any relevancy. And I love the way they put it, that this would not be relevant unless we redefine the word relevant in a manner that is circular, unlimited in scope, and out of step with the case law from analogous legal contexts involving the production of records. The third reason why the Privacy Board said that this program is not legal is that it operates by putting telephone companies under an obligation to furnish new calling records on a daily basis as they are generated, instead of turning over records they already have in their possession. This is an approach lacking foundation in the statute, one that is inconsistent with FISA as a whole. The final reason they say that this program is illegal, this is the President's own Privacy Commission, is that the statute permits only the FBI to obtain items for use in investigations, did not authorize the NSA to do anything. So Section 215 of the Patriot Act is what they're saying they're using as justification. It allows the FBI to collect records. It doesn't allow the NSA at all. So they're using a statute that was intended for the FBI to say the NSA can do this. So I think the reasons are pretty clear, 4 succinct reasons why the Patriot Act does not justify the collection of these records. The next thing the policy committee looked at was they looked at and they tried to decide whether there's been any practical effect. And I know Senator Leahy was a part of this in looking at whether or not any of these things actually did catch terrorists. But this is what they conclude, and they actually looked at the classified data. So the Privacy and Civil Liberties Commission looked at the data, looked at the classified data, and this is their conclusion. We conclude that Section 215 program, the bulk collection, has shown minimal value in safeguarding the nation from terrorism. We have not identified a single instance involving a threat to the United States in which the bulk collection program made a concrete difference in the outcome of a counterterrorism investigation. Those are pretty strong words. The Policy and Civil Liberties Board, commissioned by the President, that's bipartisan, looked at the classified data and said they didn't find a single incident, not one incident, in which it made a concrete difference in the outcome of a counterterrorism investigation. Moreover, we are aware of no instance in which the program directly contributed to the discovery of a previously unknown terrorist. What does this mean? We're not like pushing a button and generating terrorists out of this. The terrorists are coming from real information. And you have to realize this misinformation and this wrong-headed information has been used forever, for 15 years, to justify the fact that we should give up on the Fourth Amendment and we should give up on protections. Over and over again, people say, if we'd only had the Patriot Act, if we'd have had the Patriot Act, we wouldn't have had 9/11. The 2 terrorists they claim we would have gotten were in San Diego. We already knew about them. An informant lived with them for a year. The FBI wasn't talking to the CIA, and they weren't looking at lists, and they didn't know they'd come back. The CIA didn't know. Had nothing to do with having bulk collection of our records. We knew about these people. It was crummy work. It was people not doing their job. And I repeat again, no one was ever fired. We gave rewards. We gave medals of honor to everybody in the intelligence community, and no one was ever fired. There were some true heroes. The FBI agent in Arizona, the FBI agent in Minnesota, who actually discovered potential hijackers. 20th hijacker was captured a month before 9/11. That's the person who should have gotten the Medal of Honor. The person who wouldn't listen to him should have been fired. I have no understanding or awareness that anybody was ever fired over 9/11. The Policy and Civil Liberties Board goes on to say that our review suggests that Section 215 of the Patriot Act, the bulk collection of records, offers little unique value. They explore a little bit of whether or not there is a privacy problem with collecting all these records and what are the implications of collecting these records. The government's collection of a person's entire telephone calling history has a significant and detrimental effect on an individual's privacy. Beyond such individual privacy intrusions, permitting the government to routinely collect the calling records of the entire nation fundamentally shifts the balance of power between the states and its citizens, between the state and its citizens. With its power of compulsion and criminal prosecution, the government poses unique threats to privacy when it collects data on its own citizens. Compound this with the fact that the government, you could say, well, they're just collecting this data at a lower standard, but if you're not a terrorist, you don't have to worry. But here's the problem. They're collecting this data with a lower standard, a less than constitutional standard, but then they're also prosecuting you for domestic crime. Section 213 of the Patriot Act is being used 99.5% of the time for domestic crime. We're putting drug dealers in jail. That's another question and another story, but then we should vote on it as a country. Okay, for drug dealers, we're not going to have the Constitution anymore. We're going to have the Patriot Act for drug dealers. Let's be honest about it. The war on drugs has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. And so you have to admit to all the young black men and all the young brown men you've put in prison that we're no longer using the Constitution to stick you in prison. We're using the Patriot Act to put you in prison. We need to be honest with people. If the Patriot Act is about terrorism, they should adopt my amendment that says you can't be put in jail for a domestic crime under the Patriot Act. Why? Because the Patriot Act has dumbed down and loosened the standards. We don't have probable cause, we have relevance. And realize that relevance, as they say in the commission, has become completely circular and devoid of meaning if you're saying that all the records in the country are somehow relevant to an investigation that has not yet begun. The other point, they make a great point here about the fact that not only does this stifle or invade your privacy, it may well stifle your speech and your association. If you're going to be associated with, minority causes, unpopular causes, whether you're a kid from the North that went down to be in favor of civil rights, whether or not you're someone who belongs to the NAACP or the ACLU. They say yet, even though there's no evidence of abuse, and this is a big argument. Everybody says, well, there's never been any abuse, so it's fine to keep doing this. They say yet, while the danger of abuse may seem remote, given historical abuse of personal information by the government during the 20th century, the risk is more than theoretical. I couldn't agree more. Moreover, the bulk collection of telephone records can be expected to have a chilling effect on the free exercise of speech and association, because individuals and groups engaged in sensitive or controversial work have less reason to trust in the confidentiality of their relationships as revealed by their calling patterns. Realize that they're taking your phone records, your calling list, your buddy list, your ISP address, your email, and they're integrating this into some network where they can pull your name up and find out who are all your buddies, who are all your friends, who are all your Facebook friends. Realize what the potential danger is of having so much information, so much of a dossier on every American citizen, even if they're not using it. But when you think that, well, this is fine because we're not doing it and good people are running these agencies, realize that the head of the agency lied to us about this program at all. He said it didn't exist. So when you get to be trusting these people to protect your individual information, realize that at the very top of the intelligence community, the most famous person in our country dealing with intelligence lied to a congressional committee and said that this program did not even exist. The report goes on to say that the inability to expect privacy vis-a-vis the government in one's telephone communications means that people engaged in wholly lawful activities, but who for reasons justifiably do not wish the government to know about their communications, must either forego such activities, reduce their frequency, or take costly measures to hide them from the government surveillance. The telephone records program thus hinders the ability of advocacy organizations to communicate confidentially with members, donors, legislators, whistleblowers, members of the public. Initially in the 70s, when we set up the surveillance courts, the security courts, the FISA courts, they were done with individualized warrants. They got information through individualized warrants. Beginning in 2004, though, the role of the security court changed when the government approached the court with its first request to approve a program involving what is now referred to as bulk collection. For the first several years we did bulk collection, they just did it. They just said it was under the inherent authorities of the president. This should scare us because there are people who believe that the inherent authorities of the president are unlimited. That would not be a president. There would be another name for that. But if there are no limits to what the president can do, there's another name for it, and it's not president. The commission goes on to say that the judge's decision, their decision-making, would be greatly enhanced if they could hear opposing views. So the Privacy Commission advocates exactly what I'm advocating for, that you should have a lawyer in there with you, and that there should be an adversarial type of procedure. Because the thing is that it's like any other dispute. If you've ever heard two people arguing, figuring out the truth is listening to both sides and trying to gather what the truth is. So I think that we'd get to the truth a lot more if we had someone asking questions. Realize also that Section 215 of the Patriot Act says that the information has to be relevant to an investigation. Without having someone in there to argue your case, the court appears to have not really had a great deal of discussion, or to my mind, thought about whether bulk collection is somehow relevant. You might argue that if there were opposing sides, like in a traditional court, that maybe someone would stand up and say to the judge, how can this be relevant? And what investigation is it relevant to? See, I think the FISA court became such a rubber stamp that you weren't even having these questions asked. Because how could you ask that question if you're an advocate for somebody who doesn't want to give up their information? How could you ask the question whether it's relevant to an investigation, and then the government would say, well, yeah, we're going to do it. It'll be relevant when we do an investigation. No court, you would think, would understand or accept that if it were an adversarial procedure where you have a lawyer on both sides. I don't think you truly can have justice. You can't truly have a court. I think you can have a court that meets in secret. I think courts can protect individual names, and I want them to. And I thought Senator Wyden made a great point when he was out here. Intelligence activities, at their core, we have to protect the names of operatives. You don't want the code out there. Like if we have a great code and we're stealing information from our enemies and we're eavesdropping on our enemies, we don't want the code out there. It shows how smart we are and how our technology works. But if we're going to do something like collect the records of all Americans, that's a constitutional question. And you can have opinions on both sides of it. I don't think there's much of a valid constitutional reason for believing in this, but you can have an opinion. In a democratic republic, we could argue these points back and forth, but you wouldn't have the ability, you really would have to have the ability to have a discussion over these things. Because I think that without that, I don't think that we can actually get to justice.
Mr. President.
Does the senator from Kentucky yield for a question?
I would yield for a question, but not yield the floor.
Mr. President, I am wondering whether the senator from Kentucky would be good enough to confirm for me where I think the issue is that is before the Senate today. So if I might, I will speak for a few minutes about what I think is the core issue before us on the floor, and then ask the senator whether he would confirm that this is his understanding as well. Because just at the outset, I'll say it's relatively rare for my colleague from Kentucky and I to come to the floor in agreement on an issue. But it has happened before on exactly this issue. And I think it's important that it be clear to folks that there are concerns on both sides of the aisle on the critical underlying issues about how we balance privacy and liberty, security and our civil liberties. For a decade, nearly a decade, our government's operated a program that collects massive amounts of information from innocent Americans without any specific suspicion they've done anything wrong. And let me put that another way. For years, any American's communications data could have been tracked and collected by the government, whether or not they were suspected of a crime. That program's been carried out under Section 215 of the Patriot Act based on flimsy or mistaken interpretations of the original law, all in the name of our national security. Yet the bulk collection program has had disputed and not arguably clear benefit to our national security. There's not one clear publicly confirmed instance of a plot being foiled because of this Section 215 program. I've long been concerned about the scope and the reach of our intelligence community's bulk collection program. That's why in 2011 I voted, along with my colleague from Kentucky, against the straight reauthorization of the Patriot Act. I believed then, as I believe now, it would be irresponsible for Congress to continue reauthorizing the law without taking steps to address concerns about unlawful surveillance it has allowed, particularly given the fact that earlier this month, a U.S. federal circuit court specifically deemed this program illegal. Fortunately, we have an alternative, which I believe the senator from Kentucky has been expounding on behalf of, the U.s.a. Freedom Act, a bipartisan bill passed by the House just last week by an overwhelming margin. I think it was 338 to 88. It would end bulk collection by only allowing the federal government to seek call records retained by the telecommunications industry once it has established the record is relevant to an ongoing investigation. Records would no longer be stored by the government, but remain in the hands of telecommunications companies, which, under FCC rules, in order to ensure that there are customer access to records in the case of disputes, are retained for 18 months. This bill strikes an important balance by protecting America's privacy and ensuring our government can still keep our nation safe. In fact, there are some who might argue that the U.s.a. Freedom Act would allow a stronger, more robust, and more effective series of actions to keep our nation safe. I urge my colleagues to support it. I know these are difficult decisions for us to make, and I know we all have concern about our nation's security, but we have to all have concerns about our nation's freedom. We fought for it from the very beginning of our country, and I want to just thank and salute members here, colleagues, and in particular my colleague from Kentucky, for being insistent that we have clarity about time. We were told 4 years ago, when the reauthorization fight was happening, that time had run out and that we needed to reauthorize it without considering needed reforms that were discussed and debated in the Judiciary Committee. 2 years ago, some of the core elements of this were exposed to the world, and a lot of my constituents raised legitimate and serious concerns about it. Whether we are being asked to extend it for 2 weeks or 2 days or 2 hours, I think time has run out for us to even discuss reauthorizing a program that has explicitly been held illegal, and we instead need to come together, take up, and pass the U.s.a. Freedom Act. Would my colleague from Kentucky confirm that that is the situation on the floor at the moment, and on behalf of which you've been speaking?
I think what is still unclear to me is what will be taken up and what votes there will be on this. I think that the debate is a really important one. It's one that we should engage in and have a significant time to talk about, that there should be amendments offered. And as you know, sometimes the amendments get offered and then things sort of fall away. And I want to ensure that on something this important that comes up only once every 3 years, to which the court just below the Supreme Court has said that we're doing something illegally, that we don't just gloss over and just say, oh, we're going to keep on doing something that the courts have said is illegal. As far as the end result of where it comes, I want to end bulk collection, so I agree with all of the people on the U.s.a. Freedom side. I'm a little concerned that we might be transferring government bulk collection for privately held bulk collection. In the selector terms that they use in the U.s.a. Freedom Act, it says person, it says specific person, and I think it defines person, though it's still including corporation. My concern is that you could write into the specific person Verizon again, and we're back where we started. So if we could get to a point of, one, allowing some amendments to be voted on, and maybe changing it such that you can't have, see, to me the biggest issue here is a general versus a specific warrant. I don't want warrants that you can get everybody's records all at once, or even one company's. I want the warrant to say, and I'm fine with getting terrorists. I want to get terrorists. If it's John Doe's a potential terrorist, put his name on it. You can go as deep as you want into the phone records, but do specific warrants. But I don't like it if you just say, I want everybody's records from a phone company. And so I'm just concerned, are we trading one bulk collection for another form? And I need to be a little more reassured on that. I think there might be room for it if people are open to discussion on how we could figure out a way to get something through because it's going to be difficult, as you know, to get to 60. It's going to be hard either way. The other side wants they want the bulk collection. Many people want the bulk collection. They want more of it. And then there's at least half of us that think it's a wrong thing to do. I don't know the end outcome. I was uncertain enough about the outcome that I came today to try to draw attention to it. And if I had a request today, it would be for both leaderships is to let amendments to go forward, that we agree on having a pretty free amendment process. This is only every 3 years, and it's a big deal. We don't have many legislation come before us where an activity has been said to be illegal by an appellate court, and we continue to do it, and then people want to advocate to continue to do something that's illegal. But I'm going to try to see what I can get. I'm hoping to get an answer maybe today from leadership on will they allow amendments to this, and I want to be pretty certain that's going to happen because they seem to fall away sometimes.
The senator from Kentucky yield for a question.
I would like to continue to keep the floor, but we'll yield for a question without losing the floor.
Mr. President, I want to visit the senator from Kentucky for what he's doing. I think this is very, very important. And I stand here today with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to protect Americans' privacy rights. I am very concerned by the overreach we have seen in the name of national security. And I oppose efforts to reauthorize any piece of it without real reforms. Folks in Montana know that I've been an opponent of the Patriot Act since it was signed into law. Why? Because the Patriot Act violates law-abiding citizens' right to privacy, something that we hold dearly in this country. Now, we do need to make this country as secure as we possibly can, but we cannot do that at the expense of our constitutional rights. It's been talked about here earlier today. A federal court recently ruled that the NSA bulk data collection is illegal, flat illegal. So keep in mind that the NSA used the Patriot Act to authorize those data collections. Yet here in the United States Senate, some of our colleagues think that we should reauthorize those expiring provisions without even having a debate on their merits. We've seen this before. It's happened several times since I've been here in the Senate. Trying to jam an extension of the Patriot Act through the Senate at the last minute is not fair to this body, and it's not fair at all to the American people. We deserve a real debate on privacy and security here in the United States Senate. It's too important of an issue not to. We have to put some sideboards on our national intelligence agencies so that they can keep us safe without violating our constitutional rights. We need a real debate on this issue. Last week, the majority made a decision to deprive the Senate and the public of the debate by taking up a trade bill, which we could have passed in June. No doubt about it, we're approaching the Memorial Day recess. Some folks are anxious to go home, but we got work to do. I will continue to work with my colleagues to ensure that we make real reforms to the Patriot Act. If the people in this body don't know this important, they don't know the Constitution. And I would just say I want to thank everybody who spoke here today. We need to have a debate. We need to have a debate on what the Patriot Act is about, how it's being utilized, and how we need to move forward. An extension is not acceptable. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor back to the senator from Kentucky and thank him for the work that he's done on this issue.
I want to thank the senator from Montana, and I think further evidence that there is bipartisan support for the Constitution and that the Patriot Act went too far. We've heard from both senators from Montana, from opposite parties, who both want to defend the individual, want to defend the Bill of Rights, and think that we've let the government go too far. I think the American people agree with this as well. I think without question, and this is one of those things that's kind of perplexing if you think about it. If you ask most Americans, if you do a poll or a survey or ask most Americans, should the government be allowed to look at your phone records without any suspicion that you've committed a crime? I think it's a very low number who think that. But then when you get to Washington, it's almost the opposite. You have people in Washington who have, I think, viewpoints that are really, really out of step with what the American people want. The American people really, I think, have decided that the bulk collection of records is wrong, that it is unconstitutional. The second highest court in the land has said that it's illegal. And yet you still have a significant body of people in this country saying, not only keep doing it, let's do more of it. The problem is if we're going to allow records to be collected without individualized suspicion, what you're doing is allowing something, when we talk about bulk collection, that has no sort of determinants for what suspicion is. You can imagine what the danger of that is if you apply that to everything. Also, in an age where we have computers that can analyze and hold so much information, and they're building them bigger and bigger and gathering more and more and more and processing this information, the great dangers that could come from this. I wrote something about 1984 a couple of years ago, and I said when I read it the first time, you know, new Big Brother, you know, it was the danger of all these things, and I thought, oh, this is terrible. But, you know, I kind of felt comforted. I read it probably in 1978. We didn't have the technology to eavesdrop on everyone. We didn't have the technology to know everyone's whereabouts. We didn't have the technology to have cameras in every house. You know, in the book, they talk about looking at people back and forth through two-way televisions and monitoring everybody's, you know, they had to be careful where books were placed. You had to read in secret, basically. But because the technology didn't exist when I read 1984, I wasn't as concerned about it. But the thing is that you don't lose your freedom in one fell swoop. You lose it a little bit at a time. People say, well, the people doing this are good people. You know, it's like the president said. When the president signed legislation a few years ago that said that an American citizen can be detained without a trial, he said, but I am a good man and I won't use this power. It's sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of law and the rule of law that you think that the goodness of yourself or the goodness of the individuals around you somehow is the protection of the law. The law is really to protect you against bad people. The law is to protect you when bad people get in office. The law, and those who believe in the rule of law, is based on the fact that there's an understanding that in the time of history, people are democratically elected who are bad people. And that people, once given power, become addicted to it, and they want more of it. Lincoln once wrote that any man can stand adversity, but if you want to truly challenge a man, give him power. That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about unlimited power. We're not even talking about power that's constrained by law at all. The whole idea that the Patriot Act has anything to do with the bulk collection is a farce. The President's Privacy Commission has really put this in bold for us, that really there is nothing about the Patriot Act that has any resemblance to what we're doing with bulk collection. So that's not only not the rule of law, that is people within government, within the executive branch, that have made the decision that they're going to do whatever they want. One of the things that worries me about this debate, and I think it's good that we're having the debate, but there's apparently a section of the Patriot Act, as we passed the last time, that says if the Patriot Act is not extended, all things previously being investigated before will continue. So we really kind of have a perpetual Patriot Act, if you will. That worries me a little bit, but then again, it worries me even more that we're not even really paying attention to the Patriot Act. We are doing whatever we want. It is sort of a lawlessness that allows us to collect bulk records because there is no relevance to an investigation. As they said in the Privacy Commission, we're collecting the records before there's any investigation. So there is no relevancy to an investigation. The investigation hasn't started yet. Unless the investigation could be defined as everything. And I like the way they put it. They said we'd have to destroy the definition of relevancy to believe that there is any component of relevancy to this investigation. But we're collecting records of every American all of the time right now. It may not be just phone records. They say the biggest source of collection right now is probably actually through Section 702 of FISA, of the FISA amendments. We're not exactly clear what gets scooped up in that. And once again, if these are the records of foreigners, if these are the records people bent on attacking us, I'm all for getting that. But the way they're collected, and by some allegations intentionally so, we are sometimes targeting a foreigner so we don't have to use a standard at all in order to get information on an American. So let's say that they want information on you. I'm not sure why, because some of this is being used for drug crimes and domestic crime. But let's say they want information on you and they don't want to get a warrant, or a judge says no. In fact, that's sometimes happening, that a FISA court judge is saying no, and then they're using one of these other end-around ways that don't even require a FISA court judge. The level of lawlessness is appalling. The level of lawlessness is astounding. It disappoints me that the president, who was once considered by some to be somewhat of a civil libertarian, does nothing. When the president ran for office, the president said that national security letters ought to be signed by judges. He was in the exact same place where I am on civil liberties with regard to these warrants, the national security letters. Yet his administration issues them by the hundreds of thousands. I think they aren't even reporting these anymore for us. They reported them for a few years, but we're no longer getting the information. But it disappoints me that the president's not really willing to do anything about this. The president could end the bulk collection tomorrow. It is done by executive order. It could be undone by executive order. It is disingenuous at the very least that the president says, oh, or else we're going to balance liberty and security. Well, no, he's not. He's not balancing anything. He's just continuing to collect all of our records without a warrant. He's continuing to do bulk or general collection of records without a warrant. I think the American people are ready for us to be done with this. My hope is that in today that we will call attention to this, and that the American people will say, who are these people that want to keep collecting our records without a warrant? And why do they still want to do this when the people who have investigated it have determined that no one has been captured by this program? No one has been uniquely identified by this program. So there really is a consideration of whether or not we're going to listen to the American people. Are we going to wake up? Are we a representative body? The other question is, are we going to say, my goodness, it's the weekend and it's Memorial Day weekend and we're up against a deadline, so we just don't have time for listening to this. We don't have time to talk about the Bill of Rights because we just don't have time. I know it's been 3 years that we've known this date was coming up, but we don't have time. I think at the very least we could make time. And that's my request today. My request from the leadership of both sides of the aisle is, can we not make time? You know, there's at least 10 or 15 of us that will co-sponsor about 5 or 6 amendments that we want votes on. And frankly, I think the mood of the country, we have a chance on a few of these. I think, for example, the idea that we're using a lower or a less than constitutional standard to gather information that we say is for terrorism, but then we're going to put people in jail domestically for crimes that are completely and entirely unrelated to terrorism. I'd like to see how the vote turns out on that. Whether or not we can use information gathered in a non-constitutional or a less than constitutional way, whether we're going to use that for domestic crime. If you believe that, it means that we're carving out in our domestic laws an area where the Constitution doesn't entirely apply. So Section 213 allows the entering of the House in a non-constitutional way, a way that if it were done in a straight-up fashion, the courts would say is illegally gathered information and wouldn't be admissible in court. I think we ought to have a vote. Is the Patriot Act are less than constitutional means of gathering information to be used in domestic court. Here's the other question. If they'll be honest with us, are they using it in any other courts? Are there IRS investigations that begin as terrorist investigations but wind up in IRS court? In some ways, I think yes is the answer. We have now the IRS basing investigations of people, maybe for political purposes, but definitely for the purposes of whether or not individuals are doing transactions in certain ways or whether their records are in a certain way. And because it's done this way, we're not really requiring convictions before we take their stuff. This is a separate but related problem because it has to do with using records to gain entrance to people to then take their stuff without a conviction. And I think that's an important question. Are we innocent until proven guilty? Are we really going to allow the government to take possession of your things, without a conviction? I would think the presumption of innocence is an incredibly important doctrine that we shouldn't so casually dismiss. This is a poll that was commissioned by the ACLU on Monday. And in it, they ask a sample of 300 likely voters between the ages of 18 and 39. They ask them a few questions. Which of the following statements about reauthorizing the Patriot Act do you agree with more? Some people say Congress should modify the Patriot Act to limit government surveillance and protect Americans' privacy. 60% agree. Other people say Congress should preserve the Patriot Act and make no changes because it has been effective in keeping America safe from terrorists and other threats to national security like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. 34%. That's the overall numbers. If you look at it by all parties, Democrat, Independent, and GOP, 58% or greater. In fact, Democrat and Republican are pretty equal, which is interesting. 59% of Democrats, 58% of Republicans think that we've gone too far in the Patriot Act, that Americans' privacy is being disturbed by the Patriot Act. If you look at independents, it's 75% among men that are independent, 65% among women who are independent. If you ask people from this survey, do you find it concerning that the U.S. government is collecting and storing your personal information like your phone records, emails, bank statements, and other communications? 82% are concerned that the government is storing this information. Over 3/4 of voters found 4 different examples of government spying personally concerning to them. The government accessing personal communications, information or records without a judge's permission, 83%. Using that information for things other than stopping terrorists, such as I mentioned, doing convictions for drugs, were the most compelling examples for voters. They asked whether the government accesses any of your personal communications, information, or records you share with a company without a judge's permission. Tell them whether you're concerned with this issue. 83% were concerned. They asked whether the government uses information collected without a warrant for things other than stopping terrorist attacks. 83% were concerned. They asked whether if the government allows private companies to use public school technology programs to track online activities of school children. 77% were concerned. They asked whether if the government performs instant wiretaps on any phone or other telecommunications device located in the United States. 76% were concerned. From this ACLU study of young people, I believe they were all age 18 to 39. They ask whether or not these were conditions that would lead you to believe that Americans need more protections of their privacy. Local police and the FBI need a warrant issued by an independent judge for a valid reason before they search your home or property without your permission. The same should be true of your email and phone records. 84% agreed. If you ask that question in Washington, it's about a 10 or 15% question. Most people in Washington don't think that your email or your phone records should be protected by needing a warrant. But if you ask most Americans that question, particularly young Americans, should your email or your phone records be protected by a warrant? Most people say yes. The government requires some companies to intentionally include security loopholes in their services to make it easier for law enforcement to access your information. These are these backdoor things where they can insert malware. This makes the government less safe by leaving us vulnerable to terrorists and spies from foreign countries who want to harm the U.S. 81% were concerned with this and thought that we should have more privacy. I think it's clear that the American people are concerned about what we're doing. What isn't yet clear is whether the message has been transmitted to Washington, whether or not there's enough of a majority growing in Washington to actually do something about this. I think the numbers are growing. Over 300 people acknowledged that there was a problem in the House by passing legislation. Now, I have mixed feelings on the legislation. I think that without question, I agree with those who voted for it that bulk collection of records is wrong and that it should end. I've been a little more in the camp, though, that we should just end the bulk collection of records and replace it not with a new program, but with the Constitution. I personally think that we could survive with the Constitution. I think that we could also survive and catch terrorists with the Constitution. In fact, I think we can get more information with the Constitution. I think that valid warrants are much more powerful. A valid warrant allows a great deal more of information, and they're also specific. So once we're doing valid warrants, we're not doing sort of this dragnet. We're not doing sort of this just vacuuming up everything. We're not becoming overwhelmed with a lot of incidental data. What we're doing is we're specifically going to the heart of things. We're specifically going to the core of whether or not we can actually get the people who are attacking us. When we look at the privacy report that we've talked a little bit about, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, that is this bipartisan board that basically said very explicitly to the president that what he was doing is illegal. It does still boggle my mind that the president was told by his own privacy board that it was illegal and he just keeps doing it. It somewhat boggles the mind that he was told by the appellate court that what he's doing is illegal, and yet he just keeps doing it. It's an incredible deflection. It's incredibly disingenuous that the president says, well, we're going to balance liberty and security, and I'm just waiting for Congress to tell me what to do. Well, he didn't wait for Congress to tell him to collect the phone records. In fact, we never did such a thing. Even the people intimately involved with passing the Patriot Act, those who were the co-sponsors and authors of the Patriot Act, have all said they never intended and don't believe the Patriot Act gives any justification for bulk collection of records. So Congress didn't ever authorize the bulk collection of records. Two different commissions that he's put forward, the Privacy and Civil Liberties as well as the Review Commission, have both told him that it's illegal. And yet he keeps going on. I've heard very little questioning of the president or his people about this. I kind of wonder why we don't ask more questions, why we just sort of accept that a program that's said to be illegal by the courts, a program that's said to be illegal by 2 different independent commissions, why we wouldn't stop it, why the president wouldn't have the wherewithal to stop it. And it disappoints me. The program was actually begun even before the Patriot Act was finalized. We did this for a couple years just simply by presidential edict. This is another concerning development in our country, is that more and more your government is run by executive edict, by executive order. Thousands and thousands of executive orders. In the 1950s, we had a discussion of executive orders. I think it's the only time it's gone to the Supreme Court, the Youngstown Steel case. And in the Youngstown Steel case, the court came down and said that there are 3 different kinds of executive orders. There are executive orders that are clearly in furtherance of legislative action, and those are perfectly legal. There are executive orders that are debatable, whether they further legislative action or not. But then there are some executive orders that are clearly in defiance of what the legislature has done, and these are clearly illegal, and the Supreme Court struck down what Truman had done. I think we need to revisit that debate, because what's happening in our country, and it may well be the biggest problem in the country, is part of what's going on with this bulk collection, but really it's part of a bigger problem. The bigger problem is that power has drifted away from Congress or has been abdicated and given up. We gave the power to the presidency, and we didn't do it just in one fell swoop. It wasn't just Republicans, it wasn't just Democrats. It was a little bit of both, and it's been going on for probably over 100 years now. I think it accelerated in the era of Wilson, but over decades it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Under the New Deal, the executive branch grew an alarming amount, but more recently it continues to grow by leaps and bounds. It may well be the #1 issue that we face as a country is that we've had what some have described as a collapse in the separation of powers. Madison talked about that each branch would have ambition to protect their own power. So we would pit ambition against ambition, and that each would jealously guard their power, and as such, power wouldn't grow, power would be checked. But power has grown. It's grown alarmingly so, and mostly grown and gravitated to the executive branch. So in the short time that I've been here, I've seen that in many ways, the least of our bureaucrats are more powerful, probably in some ways, than the greatest of our legislators. So the most powerful of our legislators are somewhat of less power than bureaucrats. Almost every constituent that comes to talk to me from Kentucky that has a problem with government, as we explore the problem and explore the solution, we discover that Congress didn't pass their problem. Congress didn't write the rule that is beleaguering them. Congress didn't inflict the punishment that is making it difficult for them to run their business. It was done by an unelected bureaucrat. This has grown, and sometimes it's grown from even when we had well intentions, when we tried to do the right thing, but it turned out wrong, and probably that's really the story of Washington as well. Take even like the Clean Water Act. Clean Water Act, I support. I would have voted for it. 1974 says you can't discharge pollutants into a navigable stream. Well, I agree with that. The problem is that over about a 40-year period, we've come to define dirt as a pollutant, and my backyard is a navigable stream. And so once again, we take our eye off the prize. What are the things that we really ought to have the government involved with? Big bodies of water between the states, rivers, lakes, oceans, air. There is a role for the government to be involved. But because we've got people abusing the rights of private property owners and saying, if you put dirt in your backyard, we'll put you in jail, it's become sort of to the point of craziness. But it's all executive branch overreach. There was a case that went to the Supreme Court a few years ago in Idaho. And the couple lived near a lake, but about a mile from a lake. They didn't live on the lake. It was on an incline, and there were houses on both sides of their property. So they bought their property and started doing what everybody else did, backhoeing and creating a footprint and filling it and putting down footers. The EPA showed up and said that you're destroying a wetland and we're going to fine you $37,000 a day. Well, they were kind of like, well, I thought if it were a wetland, there would be water or standing water, or it would look like the Everglades, or there would be some sort of evidence that it's wetlands. Well, the EPA said, yeah, there is evidence. If any one of 300 different species of plant grows in your backyard, we can define it as a wetlands. We can take leaves, and if we flip the leaves over and they're black on the bottom, and it indicates there's moisture under the leaves, you could be a wetlands. But this all came out of crazy executive overreach. We did not do any of that. Congress did not do one iota of this expansion. It was done some by these law courts, these EPA courts, but it was done a lot by executive definition of what a wetlands is. In the early 1990s, under a Republican president, we redefined a wetlands. They commissioned a book, I don't know, 50-page book, 200-page book, and they just redefined what a wetlands was. And by redefining what a wetlands was, we doubled the amount of wetlands in the country overnight. Not by preserving land, but by redefining a lot of land that it really is not a wetland. We now are connecting all through the waters of the U.S. We're connecting everybody to the ocean somehow and saying that every bit of land is somehow connected to navigable water. I was talking to one of the senators from Idaho a year or so ago, and I liked what he told me. He told me, in Idaho, we've got a very precise definition of what a navigable stream is. You put a log in of 2-inch diameter, and it has to float 100 feet in a certain period of time. And I just love the definition of it because, yeah, that sounds like a stream that's probably moving and there's some water in it. But we now say a crevice in the side of the mountain is that if when it rains, water goes over there, is a stream. But as a consequence, we're shutting down America. People complain about jobs, but they're all for these regulations, and then they complain that they don't have a job. One gentleman decided that he was going to put dirt on his land in southern Mississippi, and it was what he considered to be uplands. There were trees growing on it, so usually trees, are not really a typical feature of wetlands. His daughter was about, I think she was 43 at the time, and he was 70. And they were going to develop the lots and sell the lots. And so he dumped some dirt there. The EPA then got involved, and they convicted him using the RICO statutes. This is what you're supposed to get gangsters with and drug dealers with the RICO. It's conspiracy. So they got him for conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act by putting clean dirt on his own land where there was no water to begin with. He was given 10 years in prison. He just got out of prison about a month ago. He's now 80 years old. That's what's happening in America. And so you wonder why some of us are worried about our records being snatched up. We're worried that our own government's run amok, that our own government's out of control, and that our own government's not really paying attention to us. And to put a 70-year-old man in prison for 10 years for putting clean dirt on his own land, the person who did that ought to go to jail. In fact, they ought to be put in a stockade and publicly flogged and then made to pay penance for a decade for doing something so stupid. But the thing is that this is going on. A guy named John Potsky was a Hungarian immigrant, came here, loved our country like so many immigrants. He came here from communism, and he loved being in our country, and he worked hard. And he had a little, like a mechanic shop, I think, in Morristown, New Jersey. Wasn't in the greatest part of town. It was a commercial part of town. There was all these commercial buildings. Across the street from him was a dump. It did flood on occasion, but the reason it flooded was the ditches were full of 7,000 tires. People just throwing all kinds of crap there. There was all kinds of rotted out automobiles. It was a junkyard. So they'd thrown all this stuff out there. He bought the land pretty cheap because it was a junkyard, and he decided to clean it up. He picked up 7,000 tires. He picked up all the rusted automobiles, and lo and behold, when you clean the drainage ditches, it no longer flooded. But he started putting some dirt on there, and the government said he was breaking the law, that he was once again contaminating wetlands. He was a Hungarian, and he didn't like to be told what to do, and I can understand the sentiment. And so he just kept putting the dirt on there, and he decided to do it at night. And they caught him because they spent, I don't know, $250,000 on cameras and surveillance to catch a guy putting dirt on his own land. He was bankrupted. They put him in jail for 3 years. They fined him $200 and something thousand. They wiped him out such that he couldn't even pay the taxes. They broke his spirit. I've met his daughter. It's just a tragic case. So you wonder why some of us are worried about the government having all of our records. I talked earlier about what happened in Westchester, and I think this is an appalling thing that should make you concerned about having records. In Westchester, I think that's where the Clintons live. But anyway, they decided they would reveal all the gun records. And so in Westchester, they revealed whether you had a gun or didn't have a gun and where you lived. And it's like, can you imagine how that might be a problem? Let's say you're a wife that's been beaten by your ex-husband and you live in fear of him and you either have a gun or don't have a gun. Either way, you don't want your ex-husband to know where you live. And particularly if you don't have a gun, you don't want your ex-husband to know that beat you that you don't have a gun. Think if you're a prosecutor or a judge. They get threatened by the people they put in jail. Would you want your name in the paper with your address and that you have a gun or don't have a gun? So you can see how privacy is kind of a big deal. Privacy can mean life and death in that kind of situation. I think we ought to be more cognizant of what a big deal this is and what a big deal the Bill of Rights is. We shouldn't be, I think, so flippant that we're like, oh yeah, whatever. Let's just, we got to be safe. And, if maybe we catch a terrorist, maybe we don't, but we've got to do this. And we just have to give up some of our freedom to be secure. It turns out, though, when you look at the objective evidence, that it doesn't appear that we are more safe. It appears that when they've alleged that we're safer, what has happened is it doesn't look like we've gotten any unique intelligence from these things. I think that probably there's nothing more important than discussing the Bill of Rights and talking about our civil liberties. I think that we need to have an adequate debate. It's supposed to be what the Senate was famous about. My hope is that from drawing some attention to this issue today, that we'll get an agreement. And that's the agreement we're going to ask for. We're going to ask for an agreement from both parties to allow amendments to the Patriot Act. We're going to ask, and we could start anytime they're ready. If somebody wants to send a message to the leadership, if they're ready to come out and allow a debate and allow amendments on the Patriot Act or a promise to do this before the expiration, we could probably get something moving. I think the American people are ready for that debate. I think the American people, look at the statistics, particularly among young people. It's a 70 to 80% issue where young people are saying, for goodness sakes, we don't want our records scooped up, vacuumed up by the government without any suspicion. I think it's also that young people get this more than others because they're used to their records being digital. They're used to their records being on their phone. They're very aware that their records are stored on a server somewhere. And you've grown to expect privacy. Now, some say, oh, that's crazy. Young people share their information all the time. Well, you do and you don't. You share your information. I share my information when I buy things online, but I'm sharing it through an agreement. The people I share it with, the companies that then market other things to me, have agreed through a privacy agreement not to share my information, not to sell my information. I'm to be anonymous, but they will market to me, but they've promised to keep me anonymous. We're comforted by the fact that we have a privacy agreement and that if millions of people sued them, they couldn't get away with revealing our information. What I don't like about some of the different things that we're doing, and this includes the u.s.a. Freedom Act, is that we give liability protection. When we give liability protection, I think it's an invitation to say, you know what, your privacy agreement really isn't that important, and if you breach it, nobody's allowed to sue you. And so I think that that's something we ought to be very careful with. And if we do end up having a debate on this, and we do end up having amendments on this, that we consider taking out the liability protection. I think also the most important thing is that if we decide that bulk collection is wrong, we need to understand how you get bulk collection. You get bulk collection because you have a non-specific warrant. You don't have an individualized warrant, you have a general warrant. This is what we've been fighting since the time of John Wilkes in 1760 in England, through James Otis in the 1760s here, through John Adams. The debate has always been about, and the thing that we found most egregious, the thing that we found most objectionable, was the idea that a warrant for your information wouldn't have your name on it. It wouldn't be individualized, or that it wouldn't be without suspicion, or that it would occur without a judge's warrant. It really was one of the things that annoyed us more than anything else. One of the things that, Adams said was the spark of our war for independence was just the sheer gall we had of British soldiers coming into our house without a warrant. Because most of your records are in your house, we don't see basically the physical and abrupt entry into your house anymore. But it happens nonetheless. It happens in just less of a physical way because your records are virtual now. But how we let people come into our house is pretty important. On the issue of warrants, this isn't specific to the Patriot Act, but it's a related issue. And the issue is whether or not we should allow people to come into our house in the middle of the night with what's called a no-knock raid. The sneak and peek, they come in and leave. The no-knock raid, you know they're there when they come. But the problem is that people are being woken up in the middle of the night and they're grabbing their gun by their bedside. If they're in a high-crime neighborhood, they have a gun by their bedside, and they're sometimes shooting the police. Most of these are looking for drugs. And I hate drugs about as much as anybody. I've seen addiction to drugs. I've worked with people as a physician, and I know what it's like. But the thing is that barging through doors in the middle of the night leads to accidents in both ways. Police get shot. Police accidentally shoot the victim sometimes. In Modesto, I think it was 2002, they burst into a home, 1 or 2 in the morning, yelled and screamed, "Everybody get on the ground, everybody get on the ground." There was an 11-year-old kid. He got on the ground, and the officer's shotgun accidentally discharged, and it was an accident, but it didn't help the kid. He died. And it's like, the thing is that, do we really need that? Do we need to come in the middle of the night looking for marijuana or any kind of drug? Couldn't we come in the daytime and knock on the door and say we've got a warrant? Now, I know police work is not without risk, and people do shoot back at them. So I understand where they're coming from and wanting to protect them and to be safe, and I want to protect the police. But I actually think it protects the police more if we go in the way we do with traditional warrants and not with unannounced warrants. Now, of course, there are different circumstances or exigencies. There are times when police go in without any warrant at all. There's something imminent going on or some threat of a dangerous situation inside, police go in. But I think for the most part, we're better off if we do things and do them in the traditional way with warrants. When we talk about how warrants have changed, one of the changes is that with the standard for what the warrant is issued with, even if it were individualized, if it says that you only have to say they're relevant to an investigation, that's a big step down from probable cause. People have defined probable cause over time in different ways. This is from Ballantyne's Law Dictionary. A common definition of probable cause is a reasonable amount of suspicion supported by circumstances sufficiently strong to justify a prudent and cautious person's belief that certain facts are probably true. Now, some lawyer must have written that, but you can kind of get a little bit of an understanding that we're supposed to go through some kind of thought process, and there's supposed to be evidence of suspicion. Now, it's not the standard of proving guilt, proving beyond preponderance of the facts are beyond any kind of doubt. But the thing is it is a standard, and it's a standard that we've had for a long time. The Oxford Companion to the American Law defines probable cause as information sufficient to warrant a prudent person's belief that evidence of a crime or contraband would be found in a search. Probable cause is a stronger standard of evidence than a reasonable suspicion, but it's weaker than that we require for a criminal conviction. Even hearsay can support probable cause if it's from a reliable source or supported by other evidence, which is kind of interesting because people are so worried about getting a warrant, but even a warrant can be supported by someone making an accusation. It's not perfect. In fact, there are some people that complain warrants are too easy to get. But the thing is that there's no evidence that it's really overly hard to get a warrant. That if we went back to the Constitution, I had this debate years ago with one of the last time it came up for renewal, and I was walking along with one of the other senators who supported the Patriot Act, and he acted as if, well, you know what, if it expires at midnight, what will we do? And, my response was maybe we could live with the Constitution at least for a while. We did for hundreds of years, Is there anything so unique about the times we live in that we couldn't still live under the Constitution? The Fourth Amendment has its origins in English common law in the saying that a man's home is his castle. This is the idea that someone has the right to defend their castle or home from invasion from the government. Based on the castle doctrine in the 1600s, landowners first recorded legal protection from casual searches from government. So some of the famous cases are actually in the 1760s, but even at least 100 years in advance of that, they were beginning to develop protections for people from the government. And it's interesting to realize that this is not a new phenomenon where we're talking about protecting ourselves from government. We protect ourselves, and government helps us protect ourselves from others who might be violent against us. But we've always, for hundreds and hundreds of years, been aware that government does bad things too, and that if you don't ration the amount of power that you give to government, that you can get to a point where the great abuse comes from government itself. So they began to use warrants, but in England, the debate quickly developed over whether a general warrant was adequate or a specific warrant. This is where John Wilkes comes in. This is where James Otis comes in. One of the debates over the separation of powers that we have, and this is pretty commonly going on, although I think the people who believe in unlimited inherent powers are probably in the majority in Washington. But there's a debate over what people call Article 2 powers. So the Article 2 is where the executive is given powers under the Constitution, but there are people who sort of believe in this unlimited nature, that there really is nothing really that restrains. In fact, some have said, even in the debate over this, that the Executive Order 12333 that is involved in some of this records production, they say that it's really none of our business because it's Article 2. It's part of the inherent powers of the president to, in times of war or times of conflict, do whatever they need to do. Well, I think that's a dangerous supposition to think that really that there are times when there are no checks and balances. I personally think that it was probably one of the most genius things that we got out of our founding fathers was the checks and balances and the division of power. Montesquieu was one of the philosophers that the founding fathers looked to, and some say, when we were setting up the separation of powers, that he was probably where we got the example. But Montesquieu said that when the executive begins to legislate, that a form of tyranny will ensue because you've allowed too much power to gravitate to one body and you haven't divided the power. The division of power was one of the if not the most important, one of the most important things we got from our founding fathers. But we're having this collapse of the separation of powers. It's getting to be where there's an ancillary body, which is Congress, and then there's the executive branch, the behemoth, the Leviathan. The executive branch is so large that really the most important laws in the land are being written by bureaucrats that no one elects and no one can unelect. In an average year, there are over 200 regulations that will cost the economy $100 million apiece. We don't vote on any of them. You vote indirectly for the president, but I think that's so indirect that it's a real problem. And I think what we have now is we have an executive branch that legislates. And so the collapse of the separation of powers is it's a collapse of the equilibrium. And this equilibrium is what kept power in check. And when I think who's to blame for this, it isn't one party, it's really both parties. When we have a Republican in office, Republicans tend to forgive a Republican president and give them more power. When we have a Democrat in office, the Democrats tend to forgive a Democrat and give the Democrat more power. A more honest sort of approach to this, or a more, I think, statesman-like approach to this, would be that if we were able to have both parties stand up as a body, and if there were pride in the institution of Congress, pride such that we were jealous of our power, that we were pitting our ambition to keep our power against the ambition of the president, regardless of the president's party affiliation, then we might have a chance. A lot of the things about collection of bulk data were not known for years and years, but have been going on for a long time. One of the things that I found most troubling in the John Napier tie op-ed was that he said, and he was giving a speech, and he said, well, the good news is that if the American people are upset, if they're upset about things, intelligence activities, and they think it's an overreach, that they have every opportunity to use the democratic process to change things. This went through the White House censor, and the White House censor, counsel, advisor, boss, decided that they needed to take that out of his speech because they didn't want to imply, really, that intelligence activities could be changed through democratic action. Because they took the opinion, apparently, that the inherent powers of Article 2 are not subject to democratic action. So when I think of the people who say that the inherent powers are unlimited and that the president has these powers that are not to be checked by Congress, I don't think of a presidency. I think of a different word, and it's not president. So I'm very concerned about whether or not we're going to let this go on. There are some other side effects that come from this. As you allow the executive branch unlimited power, as you allow the bureaucracy to grow, a consequence or a side effect has been that the debt has grown to alarming portions. We borrow about $1 million a minute. We have an $18 trillion debt. And as the debt has grown larger, the executive branch has grown bigger, your congressmen and women have grown more ancillary and more peripheral to the entire process. But I'm one who believes that there are limits. I think there is a limit to how much debt we can incur and how rapidly we can incur it. I think already we see sort of an anchor or a burden, an effect on the economy that pulls us down and causes growth to be less vibrant. Some say 1 million jobs a year, are being prevented from being created because of this. So I think that if we're not careful, that this collapse of the separation of powers, this collapse of equilibrium, as we let this get away from us, that really we're also getting away from us the control over our future. We're letting the power accumulate in such a rapid fashion that if you want to see how much power is accumulating, you could almost make the analogy of looking at the debt clock. If you go to debtclock.org and just watch the debt spiraling out of control, as the debt grows larger and larger, I think you basically are seeing a corresponding diminishment of your freedom. And it is of concern. It's of concern how rapidly this is happening. There's sort of, I think, two philosophic reasons why we should be concerned about power. One, that power corrupts, but really more basic than that is that as power grows, there has to be a corresponding loss of your freedom. I call this sort of the liberty argument for minimizing government. Thomas Paine sort of made this argument. Thomas Paine said that government is a necessary evil. What did he mean by that? I think what he meant by that is that you need government. We need government for a stabilizing force. There are things that government needs to do. But it's a necessary evil because you have to give up your liberty to have some government. How do you give up your liberty? You give up some of what you earn. Your liberty is who you are. The liberty is what you produce with your hands. And the liberty is what people will pay you to do things with your hands, what you do and produce. That's your income, that's you, that's your liberty. So if we have 100% taxation, I would say you have no liberty. You're essentially a slave to the state. If you have 50%, you're only half slave, half free. But the thing is that the smaller your government, the lower your taxation, the more free you are. But it's an argument for, if you're concerned about freedom, you'd want as small a government as you possibly could have that still did the things that you think are necessary. The other argument I like for why you should keep your government small is what I call the efficiency argument. The efficiency argument, I think, was best expounded by Milton Friedman, who said that nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. And there's sort of a truism to that, and you think about it in your own life. If I ask you for $1,000 to invest in a business enterprise, you'll think, how long did it take me to earn $1,000? You'll think, I had to pay taxes, I had to save, I had to pay all my expenses to get this $1,000. And you'll think how much you prize that, and you won't make the decision in an easy fashion. You'll make your decision not perfectly, but if you compare your decision spending your money to a politician spending the money, it's just bound to be a wiser decision. It's a more heart-wrenching decision, and it ends up typically probably being a better decision. Because your politicians, if you ask a politician for $1 million, that might be equivalent to 1,000, or it might not mean anything to them. You might ask them for $10 billion. I mean, think about it this way. We gave $500 million to one of the richest guys in our country to build something that nobody seemed to want. And he lost all of the money. And you think to yourself, do you think the person in the Department of Energy that gave $500 million to one of the richest guys in the country to build something we didn't want feels bad or doesn't sleep well at night? No, I think they gave that person the money because that person was a big contributor. They were an activist for their candidate, so when they got in power, they used the Department of Energy as their own personal piggy bank to pass out loans to their friends. But nobody feels bad about the fact that they lost the money because it wasn't their money. So it's the efficiency argument for why you should think that government should be small. Before the Patriot Act, there was something called stellar wind. This was a secret also, and we didn't learn about this for many years, but this was started immediately after 9/11 and was revealed by Thomas Tam at the New York Times in 2008. But it basically was a prelude to the bulk collection that we're having now. So the amazing thing about bulk collection is none of this is new. It's been going on now for 14 or 15 years. It doesn't make it any less objectionable, but it's not new. We've now had bulk collection under 2 different administrations. One administration got a great deal of grief for this, and then the next party ran and said, we're going to change these things and we're going to do things differently, and they did them the same or more so. So there really hadn't been any changed, and that's why some people, I guess, are concerned about whether or not we truly get change. The program's activities in Stellar Wind involve data mining of large databases of communications of American citizens, including emails, telephone conversations, financial transactions, and internet activity. William Binney, a retired leader within the NSA, became a whistleblower because he believed these programs to be unconstitutional. The intelligence community also was able to obtain from the Treasury Department suspicious activity reports. So we're back to these banking reports that are issued also. If we decide to fix bulk records and try to do something about this, I think, injustice, the main thing is we should be aware that this isn't the only program. There's probably a dozen programs. There's probably another dozen we haven't even heard of that they won't tell any of us about. And realize that they're not asking Congress for permission. They are doing whatever they want. We did not give them permission under the Patriot Act to do bulk collection of phone records. They are doing it with no authority or inherent authority or some other authority because the courts have already told them that there is no authority under the Patriot Act. There's also no common sense logic that could explain, no common sense logic that could say that there's a relevancy to all the data of every American. When Stellar Wind came about, there were internal disputes within the Justice Department about the legality of the program because the data was being collected for large numbers of people, not just the subjects of FISA warrants. The Stellar Wind cases were referred to by FBI agents as pizza cases because many seemingly suspicious cases turned out to be food takeout orders. Imagine also that if we're looking for interconnecting spots, that a lot of people order pizza. According to Mueller, approximately 99% of the cases led nowhere. Nevertheless, internal counsel for the administration said that because the nation had been thrust into an armed conflict by a foreign attack, the president has determined in his role as commander-in-chief that it is essential for defense against a further attack to use these wiretapping capabilities within the United States. He has inherent constitutional authority to order warrantless wiretapping. The memo goes one step further. It says that the president has inherent constitutional authority to order warrantless wiretapping. We're talking about warrantless. We're not talking about any kind of subpoena here. Warrantless wiretapping. And it goes on, here's the conclusion. An authority that Congress cannot curtail. So if we really believe that bulk collection is wrong, and if we really believe that we need to be a check and balance on the president, we should just be getting started with reining him in on bulk collection, because the president, this was the previous administration, but the president says that these authorities they're using cannot be curtailed by Congress. If you talk about a presidency that has powers that are not checked by Congress, I don't think we're talking about a presidency here. There's another name for that kind of leader, but it's not president. The argument here is astounding. The argument here is that they can collect anything they want without a warrant because the president has inherent constitutional authority to order warrantless wiretapping, an authority that Congress cannot curtail. I think that's alarming. A few years later, though, the Office of Legal Counsel came back, this is also from the administration, and concluded that at least the email program was not legal. And then acting Attorney General James Comey refused to reauthorize it. William Binney, a former NSA codebreaker that we've talked about, who is a whistleblower, talked about some of the activities of the NSA. He said they have highly secured rooms that tap into major switches and satellite communications at both AT&T and Verizon. The article, I believe this was New York Times, suggested that supposedly dispatched Stellar Wind, supposedly they were no longer doing this, continues as an active program. This conclusion was supported by the exposure of room 641A in AT&T's operations center in San Francisco in 2006. It gets back to the trust factor. The director of national intelligence said they weren't collecting any bulk data, but he wasn't telling the truth. They tell us Stellar Wind ended some back in 2005, 2006, but then we find a room at AT&T that's still hooked up directly to the NSA. I would like to see the phone companies be better defenders of our privacy, but with the Patriot Act, we gave them immunity. Even if there were some individuals in the phone companies that cared about your privacy and thought that your phone conversations should be protected, why do it? You can't sue them. If you have a privacy agreement with your phone company, they don't care. Nobody can sue them. It has no protection. You have no standing in court to protect yourself. It's one of the problems of the u.s.a. Freedom Act is that we're giving liability protection once again to the phone companies for something new. One question I would ask, if there was anybody that would actually tell you the answer, would be, if we already gave them liability protection under the Patriot Act, why are they getting it again under the u.s.a. Freedom Act, unless we're asking them to do something new that they didn't have permission for? The other problem with the u.s.a. Freedom Act is, if you think bulk collection is wrong, why do they need new authorities? Why are we giving them some kind of new authority? Are we restricting their authority in 215, Section 215 of the Patriot Act on one hand, and then expanding it on another? I think when people are dishonest with you, you're right to be doubtful, and you're right to try to circumscribe and to put their power in a box such that you can watch them and make sure that they're honest. In June of 2013, the Washington Post and the Guardian published an offer from the Office of the Inspector General draft report dated March 2009 that detailed the Stellar Wind program. So still in 2009, there was evidence that Stellar Wind was still going on. And realized Stellar Wind's not what we're talking about. Stellar Wind would be other bits of information that are being collected beyond your phone records. So I think if we had someone here, or if we had somebody who would honestly tell us, I'd sure like to know, do they absorb and collect all of our credit card information? I have a feeling it probably is done. I don't know, and I've not been told, so I'm not revealing a secret, but I guess it is done. I'm guessing all of your records are collected. Because the thing is we have the audacity of the executive branch saying that they have inherent constitutional authority to do anything they want, to order warrantless wiretapping. According to the executive branch, They have an authority that Congress cannot curtail. That doesn't sound like the office of the presidency to me. It sounds like the office of a governmental official that you have no control over. It sounds inconsistent or antithetical to really a constitutional republic. How can you have a presidency that has unlimited power? That's what they're telling you. Now, they're telling you it's in the service of good. We're going to catch terrorists, we're going to do good things, and we're going to look at all of your information, but we're never going to abuse your privacy. During September 2014, the New York Times asserted questions persist after the release of a newly declassified version of a legal memo from the NSA Stellar Wind program, a set of warrantless surveillance and data collection activities secretly authorized after 2001. The article addressed the release of newly declassified version of the 2004 memo. Note was made that the bulk program, telephone, internet, email surveillance of American citizens remained secret until the revelations by Edward Snowden. And that to date, significant portions of the memo remain redacted in the newly released version as well, that doubts and questions about its legality continue to persist. When we go back to the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, as they get closer to their conclusion, they talk about, once again, the idea that you're only hearing one side. And I think no matter how honest, no matter how patriotic people are, one side just won't do it. You can't find the whole truth when only the government presents their position. The Civil Liberties Privacy Board says that the proceedings with only one side being presented raise concerns that the court does not take adequate account of positions other than those of the government. They recommended the creation of a panel of private attorneys, special advocates, who can be brought into cases involving novel and significant issues by FISA court judges. I think this would be a step in the right direction, but I think also that what we need to do is we really probably should give you the ability to have your own attorney. If this is a court proceeding, I think having your own attorney, so you really have somebody who works for you, who is your advocate. But a special advocate would be better than what we have. The board goes on to conclude, transparency is one of the foundations of democratic governance. Our constitutional system of government relies upon the participation of an informed electorate. This, in turn, requires public access to information about the activities of the government. Transparency supports accountability. I couldn't agree more. It's even more important when you talk about the intelligence agency because of the extraordinary power we give to these people. The extraordinary power we give them to invade our privacy and to have tools to invade our privacy, we have to trust them. So there needs to be a degree of transparency. The transparency doesn't have to involve state secrets. It doesn't have to involve code or names, but the transparency needs to be involved what they're doing. The thing is that, do you think any terrorist in the world doesn't realize that all the information is being scarped up? It is not a secret that they're doing this. So we should have an open debate in a free society about how it should be done and whether you can gather information in a way that's consistent with the Constitution. When we get to the Privacy and Civil Liberty Board's recommendations, they have several good recommendations. Number one, the government should end its Section 215 bulk telephone records program, period. They say that the program, as it is constituted, implicates constitutional concerns under the First and Fourth Amendments. This is the President's Privacy and Civil Liberties Board. Without the current Section 215 program, the government would still be able to seek telephone calling records directly from the communications providers through other existing legal authorities. I think the other existing legal authorities could be the Constitution. Could we not just call a judge and get a warrant and go down to the phone company and get what we want? I think there's a way that we can do this that is still consistent with the Constitution. The other recommendation they have, other than ending the program, is that when the bulk collection program is ended, that the records should be purged, so there's no chance that this can be abused again in the future. One of the arguments for the NSA has been that they collect the data, it's in a database, but that it's only accessed then when they have what they call reasonable articulable suspicion. One of the recommendations of the Privacy Board, though, was that they not be given the ability to judge whether there is reasonable articulable suspicion, that it would actually go to an independent judge to determine this. So the recommendation of the Policy Board was that these should go to the review of the FISA court before they are able to query the database. There are many different groups that have been fighting for privacy in our country, and it's a coalition of people both from the right and from the left. You've seen it today as different senators have come out here. We've had senators from the Republican Party as well as the Democrat Party. We've had those from the right, from the left. We've had conservatives, libertarians. We've had progressives. There's been a combination of folks who all sort of have one thing in common, and that's the belief that the Bill of Rights should be protected. Among the private groups that have done a good job with this, Electronic Frontier Foundation has been one of the groups that's done a great job here. In one of their newsletters, they quote Ron Wyden, and he says, "We have not yet seen any evidence showing that the NSA's dragnet collection of Americans' phone records has produced any uniquely valuable intelligence." Patrick Eddington writes for Cato. Cato's been another group that's been a good supporter of privacy. In an article that talks about the upcoming battle from a couple of weeks ago, he writes, this is of the u.s.a. Freedom Act. And this is sort of the big debate, because many people on both sides of the aisle think that the bulk collection of records is not constitutional. We think it exceeds the government's power, exceeds the Constitution. But what many are proposing to replace it is the u.s.a. Freedom Act. This is what Patrick Eddington writes. The u.s.a. Freedom Act claims to end the controversial telephone metadata program, but a close reading of the bill reveals that it actually leaves key part of Patriot Act definitions of person or U.S. person intact. So a person is defined as any individual, including officer or employee of the federal government, or any group, entity, association, corporation, or foreign power. So the question I have is, it sounds good that we're going to make the definition of whose records we go out. We're going to say it's going to be a specific U.S. person. The problem is that we then define person as corporation. And so we get back to the same argument. If we're going to search the database of all of your phone calls and we say that a person is Verizon, we're stuck again back collecting everybody's records. And what I don't want to have happen, and I won't be able to support, is a bill that becomes bulk collection of your records just under a different venue. You know, to me, I'm not sure that your privacy has been protected more if that we're now just asking the phone companies for bulk collection, where we were taking their data, sourcing it, and getting it from the companies after they gave it to the government. I'm just not sure if it's that much distinctly difference. In the u.s.a. Freedom Act, they talk about the idea that we would get special advocates, and I'm for that. I think that's a good idea. But Patrick Eddington points out a flaw in this. He says that the FISA court has sole discretion to appoint or not appoint these amicus curiae, or these special advocates. So it could be that a FISA court that really has not been too inquisitive, a FISA court that has determined that all of your records are somehow relevant, may not be the most inquisitive to appoint an advocate for you if they've been able to define relevance as meaning all of your records. Another deficiency of the u.s.a. Freedom Act is that it does not address bulk collection under Executive Order 12333. The bill also fails to address bulk collection under Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. Now, you could just say, what are you complaining about? You're getting some improvement. You still got problems, but we're getting some improvement. I guess my point is that we're having this debate, and we don't have it very often. We're having the debate every 3 years, and some people have tried to make this permanent where we'd never have any debate. And even though we're only having it every 3 years, it's still uncertain whether I'll be granted any amendments to this bill. So, yeah, I'd like to address everything while we can. I think we ought to address Section 702. I think we ought to, for goodness sakes, why wouldn't we have some hearings on the Executive Order 12333? Now, I think they may be having them in secret, but I go back to what Senator Wyden said earlier. I think the principles of the law could be discussed in public. We don't have to reveal how we do stuff. Do you think anybody in the world thinks we're not looking at their stuff? Why don't we explore the legality and the law of how we're doing it, as opposed to leaving it unsaid and unknown and secret? Part of our secrecy is sort of backfiring on us also, because what's happening is, in keeping this secret, people believe the worst. Everybody around the world believes the worst about us. Everybody around the world believes that they're having all their stuff looked at, that their emails will be looked at. So if you're a business person in Europe and you're trying to negotiate a secure deal, a deal that you don't want your competitors to know what you're offering to buy a certain company, I would think you probably wouldn't use American email. And I would guess that's what's happening. American companies are starting to try to figure out a way around this to try to offer encryption. And what's the government do? The president's administration's all over the airwaves, all over Washington, all over the place, talking about how that the companies are somehow evil for wanting to encrypt their data. And I saw the Secretary of Homeland Security in my committee the other day, and I said, you realize it's your fault. It's not the company's fault that they're trying to protect their information for their customers. They're trying to make a living. It's your fault for bullying them and stealing their information and stealing all of Americans' information. We're simply reacting to the bully that you are. Most of the things that Patrick Eddington points out in this piece are things that we actually have amendments that would make stronger. So if there are arguments that maybe the USA Freedom Act could be made better, definitely reauthorizing it by itself is a big mistake, but that if there's going to be offered alternatives, then maybe we could try to offer alternatives that makes the USA Freedom Act better. The other one that they offer here, or that Patrick Eddington puts forward, is that there's no bar on the government imposing backdoors being built into electronic devices. So that's what we've talked about before, that the government is mandating to different companies that they have to have access to their product. And I think it's been an under-discussed development that the companies are going to be more at risk for sabotage by foreign countries, foreign governments, and sabotage from hackers if they build a portal. So if the government says, we need a portal to stick our big nose in your business and suck up all your information, my guess is that sophisticated hackers and sophisticated foreign governments will say, you know what? Most of American software now has a flaw, and the American government's getting into it. What do you think that these people will do? Develop programs to look for the flaws and churn through until they find our flaws. It's the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be trying to keep foreign governments, foreign snoopers, foreign competitors out of our stuff, including the U.S. government. But we're doing the opposite. There's a lot to be desired with the U.S. Freedom Act. I try to be supportive of moving forward, but I can't support it unless we're able to incorporate some of the other ideas that I think are necessary. The people who say we're just not doing enough. This week, many have come out and said, we've got to collect more data. We've got to, we're only collecting a third of the data. We've got to get more data. The interesting thing is that we're spending $52 billion a year on intelligence in our country. $52 billion. $10 billion in the NSA alone. It's $167 per person in the U.S. I think it's hard to argue we're not doing enough already. I think the argument can be made, though, that we're doing it in such a haphazard, all-collecting, all-consuming, indiscriminate way that maybe we're not getting the best bang for our buck. There have been many groups out there. We mentioned Electronic Frontier Foundation, Tech Freedom, Liberty Coalition, Gen Opportunity, Competitive Enterprise Institute, FreedomWorks. A lot of different groups from right and left that are opposed to this bulk collection of data. There was an interesting article recently written by Anthony Romero with the ACLU, and the title of it was "The Sun Must Go Down on the Patriot Act." In it, he refers back to both, the review group that we talked about and the Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and he says and reiterates a point that's incredibly important, that there's no evidence at all that the NSA's massive surveillance program has ever played a pivotal role in any investigation. See, I think we ought to be able to figure out something from this, and we ought to be able to learn that not only is there the constitutional question of this, there's also the question of whether practically it's doing anything to make us safer. If it's not making us safer, it's extraordinarily expensive, and we're losing our freedom in the process. Why don't we shut it down? Different advocacy groups for a variety of opinions have put forward the idea that I think was represented in the NAACP versus Alabama. I believe this was back in the 70s, which set forth a First Amendment claim. And this claim is that there's a vital relationship between freedom of association and privacy in one's associations. The point is that sometimes when you're protesting either for or against something, it's very unpopular. Sometimes you even worry about your safety. There were people who lost their lives in the freedom movement and the civil rights movement. There were people who lost their lives, and you can understand how in those days people might have been worried for anybody to know that they belonged to the NAACP or that they opposed the Jim Crow of the South. But it was an important case because it talked about how the fact is that information can be kept private and should be kept private for fear that it will chill speech, for fear that it will put a damper on who people would associate, for fear that it would put a damper on dissent, which is a fundamental aspect of a republic. In a letter from a couple of weeks ago from some congressional leaders, they point out something that I think bears repeating. Mass surveillance, the bulk collection, harms our economy. Mass surveillance will cost the digital economy up to $180 billion in lost revenue by 2016. We're not getting any new bad guys with this. We're abrogating privacy, and then we're losing money. The internet companies in our country, the whole software world, the whole hardware, all of this have been some of America's greatest triumphs, some of America's greatest ingenuity. And yet, we're willing to squash all that in a battle that really is going to damage our privacy, isn't helping us in the war against terrorism, and is going to make it such that nobody in the world is going to want to buy American products. I think it's a disgrace. And I think it's once again, it's not, I don't think it's purposeful. Nobody wants to harm our companies, but I think it is another unintended consequence of a bad policy not thought through. The ACLU commentary on the U.S.A. Freedom Act has come up with some ideas of things they could think would make the bill stronger. One, they say that the bill could be amended to prevent surveillance of individuals with no nexus to terrorism. The U.S.A. Freedom Act would authorize the collection of records and communications identified by a specific term. This would stop the government from conducting indiscriminate surveillance of virtually all citizens from engaging in narrower but still egregious forms of abuse, like the surveillance of everyone in a zip code or all those who use a given communications provider like Gmail. However, the current SST definition is not strong enough to protect bulky collection. This is the point I've been making. And this is something you have to be really careful in Washington, because the minute you think you've won a battle, secretly you've been beaten, you just don't know it yet. And so we might get a reform like this and then find out that we're still going to get bulky collection, that a corporation's name could be put in the specific selector term. And so we were worried about the government giving us all of Verizon's records. Now we're just sending a warrant to Verizon that has their name in it, and we're getting all of their records. The example they put here is that you could still end up having the surveillance of everyone in an entire zip code or all of those who use a given communications provider like Gmail. So if Gmail is a specific term, are we not still back where we were, and have we really fixed the problem? The ACLU goes on to say that the bill should be amended to narrow the SST definition, the selector term, to prevent this kind of bulky surveillance. The bill should also make crystal clear consistent with the Second Circuit, which has come out since this bill was written, that Section 215 cannot be used to amass Americans' records for open-ended data mining purposes unmoored from any specific investigation. I think this is incredibly important. The USA Freedom Act wants to take a step forward, but we need to make sure that the ruling from the Second Court that has already passed, that we don't do something that either moots the case or we don't do something that actually expands the power of 215 when the court has already restricted the power of 215. The ACLU's second recommendation is that we should include procedures to ensure that the government purges irrelevant information. Right now, the bill would allow the collection of irrelevant information under 215 and other authorities without minimization procedures. This kind of reminds me, if you want to know how much information we're grabbing up and to be how worried about it, there was an article in the Washington Post a couple of months ago, and it said that the president had been minimized 1,227 times. We're collecting the president's data, all right? Now, you could say, well, we're being fair, we're getting everybody's. For goodness sakes, we should not be collecting the president's information. In fact, you might inadvertently have somebody reading that who really shouldn't be reading the president's information. We should not be collecting the president's information. That's ridiculous. But we're minimizing the president, which means we're finding it, then we're sort of whiting it out and hoping nobody read it in the process. There were earlier versions of the USA Freedom Act that included some of these basic protections on getting rid of or minimizing irrelevant information that's got up, the bulky surveillance. This is sort of the problem. This bill started out pretty good in the House, got out of committee, got sort of eaten up on the floor, and wound up losing a lot of the better stuff that was in it. The third recommendation is what we mentioned a few minutes ago, is to make sure that there's a strong advocate, these special advocates, that it's a strong advocate that goes before the FISA court. As the Second Court decision observes, adversarial judicial process is vital, especially on matters as critically important as the government's authority to spy on its citizens. This is a really important point. The adversarial judicial process. There's some, Judge Napolitano has written on this, and I think he's made the point that without an adversarial process, you really can't even have a judicial process. If you don't have people on both sides arguing or advocating for a position, then it really isn't a court. I mean, it really is not a judicial proceeding that we can recognize as finding justice. But the FISA court only hears from one side, the government. But the ACLU points out that these advocates participate solely at the discretion of the court and can make arguments that do not advance privacy and civil liberties. Yeah, I mean, if you're hired by the government, are you really going to be the best advocate for privacy? The fourth suggestion that the ACLU has to make the USA Freedom Act better is that we should limit additional authorities that have been used to collect America's records in bulk. We now know that the government has conducted bulk surveillance not only under 215, but also under a host of other statutes, including existing administrative subpoena authorities. For example, for 2 decades, up until 2013, the Drug Enforcement Agency operated a program that collected the international call records of Americans in bulk, reporting under existing administrative subpoena laws. So here's a real question. What other authorities are we operating under that are collecting bulk records? They're doing it under administrative subpoena laws. They're doing it for the DEA. So I still think the more I've learned about this, the more questions I have as to how many other authorities are still collecting things. I'd still like to know, are they collecting all the credit card information in the country? Are they doing that under executive authority? Are we really living in a country now where nobody in the government questions somebody when they say that under Article 2 authority, the president can do whatever he wants and that this can't even be corrected or challenged at all by Congress? The fifth recommendation from the ACLU was to stop the government from using Section 702 of FISA as a backdoor to conduct surveillance on Americans. This was one of our amendments that we also have. In fact, most of these are amendments that I will present if we're allowed to present them, and which is sort of the purpose for being here and for wearing my feet out and my voice today, is that we'd like to find out, will the leadership allow us to have amendments? We would like to know and have an agreement that we will specifically be allowed to offer these amendments that we've worked on for 6 months to a year now. We've waited for 3 years for the opportunity. We'd like to know, will leadership let us have these amendments? Will leadership allow a free and open debate over how to fix this bulk collection program? The backdoor thing with 702 is a pretty important thing, and it's collecting enormous amounts of data. Earlier in the day, we talked about how this data, that 9 out of 10 pieces of data are not about the target. They're just incidental. So I think there was one estimate that we've had 90,000 targets, but it really means we've had 900,000 bits of information on other individuals collected, but it all just gets stuck in a database. So the database keeps growing and growing, and sometimes it's intentionally so that we want to investigate a guy here, but we don't want to ask for a warrant, so we investigate a guy overseas that we know already talks to a guy over here. Now we're really investigating Americans without a warrant. So they recommend that we stop this backdoor access. This is something Senator Wyden and I have also been in favor of as well. Another recommendation that the ACLU has here is that, our current laws punish individuals for providing material support to terrorists. I have no problem with that, but they have been used apparently to prosecute people that have been seeking to provide humanitarian assistance. The u.s.a. Freedom Act should add an explicit intent requirement to the material support laws. There's another comment from the Sunlight Foundation by Sean Vidka, and the title is, "The u.s.a. Freedom Act is about to pass the House. Is it a step backwards?" Sunlight and others have had major concerns about the u.s.a. Freedom Act for some time. Broadly speaking, it isn't a satisfactory level of reform given what we've learned in the past 2 years about government surveillance and the immense secrecy that surrounds it. Until last week, it's fair to say some considered the bill a net positive, some a net negative, and that no one thought it was enough for reform. As time has progressed, we've seen what began in 2013 as a decent, if tunnel-visioned, compromise chipped away at, including the transparency and accountability provisions. Now, I think this is an important point because u.s.a. Freedom started out pretty good and it got a little bit less good over time. But think about where we are right now. Passed overwhelmingly in the House. The majority in the Senate doesn't want it because they think it lessens the bulk collection too much. So they're going to chip away at it again. So imagine where we're going to be in the end if that's what we're going to pass. I think it'd be better just to be done with bulk collection. Let's be done with bulk collection. Let's start over, but let's don't replace it with something that may end up being just as bad. The sacrifices made in the bill in order to secure these modest reforms grew more dramatic. For instance, while u.s.a. Freedom was always a threat to court challenges and may have mooted the ACLU's tremendous court win last week if it had passed last year. This is the point I've been making. The luckiest thing we ever got is we didn't pass u.s.a. Freedom last year because the courts are probably going to do right now, I think, a better job than legislation. In fact, we might be better off not passing the u.s.a. Freedom Act and seeing what the courts will do for us on this. Because there is a danger it moots the case, but there's a danger also that it's seen as actually given justification for the program, which kind of, I guess, is a way of mooting the case as well. The ruling in the appellate court could also, they're agreeing with what I just said, could also do more than USA Freedom aspired to do, because it interprets the word relevance, saying it doesn't authorize bulk collection, and that the word is not only used, and that word is not used in Section 215. So I think that's a good point, that, the court is saying that the word relevance doesn't authorize bulk collection. And so you've got bulk collection going on, but no authorization from 215 on it. Here's the question: is USA Freedom going to allow bulky, perhaps bulk collection, and do we wind up actually giving back more power to the intelligence community when we're trying to limit their power? I think we need to be very careful with what we do here. Sunlight goes on to say, Sean Vidka, it's unclear whether the primary goal of USA Freedom, the rewriting of Section 215 to stop bulk collection, is already accomplished, and whether USA Freedom could open us all up to more secret interpretations and new venues of surveillance. I think that's an incredibly important question. Several groups that initially supported USA Freedom have backed away from it. ACLU and EFF agreeing that the U.S. freedom as it stands now is not worthy of support. And I think some of these may be neutral on it, but they've backed away from some of their support. Some of the concerns that Sean Vidka talks about here about shortcomings in USA Freedom Act is that he says that it accepts the premise that mass surveillance under these programs is necessary, despite the findings of the Congressional Joint Inquiry and the 9/11 Commission to the contrary. Also, despite the Privacy and Civil Liberties Commission that said it wasn't necessary. Sean Didka goes on to say that one of his other concerns is that the U.S. Freedoms Act effectively continues mass surveillance under Section 215 of the Patriot Act through the use of multiple NSA-supplied selector terms. So you could say we're only going to do individual terms, but then you do a bunch of them. By the time we do a bunch, are we really individualizing it and not growing it into bulk collection? They include among these selection terms ones they're worried about, including the Internet Protocol address or cloud storage accounts of entire organizations, in contravention of the Fourth Amendment's particularized probable cause-based warrant. Additionally, Sunlight goes on to point out what I've pointed out as well, that the term person is not defined as an individual natural person, and the bill does not alter the Patriot Act's original definition of person, which includes any individual, officer or employee of the federal government, or any group, entity, association, corporation. I really fear what we could be back here doing is we think we won, we get the USA Freedom Act, and then 2 years from now we find out they're plugging the name Verizon into their selection term, and they're still collecting all the records from Verizon. So I think unless you can limit this to an individual, a natural person, I think really that's one of the biggest problems that we've got with the U.S. Freedom Act at this point. Sean Ditka goes on to say that there's a concern that it expands the corporate immunity, and we've discussed that as well today, that by removing the requirement that companies act in good faith, we also are going to pay the companies now to do this as well. Judge Napolitano wrote about this just the other day, May 14th. He writes, a decision last week about NSA spying by a panel of judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals in New York City sent shockwaves through the government. The court ruled that a section of the Patriot Act that is due to expire at the end of this month, on which the government has relied as a basis for its bulk collection and acquisition of telephone data in the past 14 years, does not authorize that acquisition. This may sound like legal mumbo-jumbo, but it goes to the heart of the relationship between the people and their government in a free society. The Patriot Act is the centerpiece of the federal government's false claim that by surrendering our personal liberties to it, it can somehow keep us safe. The liberty for safety offer has been around for millennia and was poignant at the time of the founding of the American Republic. The framers addressed it in the Constitution itself, where they recognized the primacy of the right to privacy and assured against its violation by government by intentionally forcing it to jump through some difficult hoops before it can capture our thoughts, words, or private behavior. These hoops are the requirement of a search warrant issued by a judge based on evidence called probable cause, demonstrating that it is more likely than not that the government will find what it's looking for from the person or place it is targeting. Only then may a judge issue a warrant which must specifically describe the place to be searched or specifically identify the person or thing to be seized. Napolitano goes on, none of this is new. It has been at the core of our system of government since the 1790s. It is embodied in the Fourth Amendment, which is the heart of the Bill of Rights. It is quintessentially American. The Patriot Act has purported to do away with the search warrant requirements by employing language so intentionally vague that the government can interpret it as it wishes. Add to this the secret venue for this interpretation, the FISA court, to which the Patriot Act directs that NSA applications for authority to spy on Americans are to be made. And you have the totalitarian stew that we have been force-fed since 2001. Because the FISA court meets in secret, Americans did not know that the feds were spying on us all of the time and relying on their own unnatural reading of the words in the Patriot Act to justify it until Edward Snowden spilled the beans on his former employer nearly 2 years ago. Another reason, I think, to question whether or not the u.s.a. freedom may be the best bill for us. There was an article in the Daily Beast by Shane Harris the other day, and the title of it is Big Win for Big Brother. NSA celebrates the bill that's designed to cuff them. It was supposed to be the declawing of America's biggest spy agency, but what no one wants to say out loud is that this is a big win for the NSA, one former top spook says. Civil libertarians and privacy advocates were applauding yesterday after the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed legislation to stop the NSA from collecting America's phone records in bulk. But they'd best not break out the bubbly. The real big winner here is the NSA. Over at its headquarters in Fort Meade, intelligence officials are high-fiving because they know things could have turned out much worse. What no one wants to say out loud is that this is a big win for the NSA and a huge nothing burger for the privacy community, said a former senior intelligence official. one of a half a dozen who spoke to the Daily Beast about the phone records program and efforts to change it. Here's the dirty little secret that spooks are loath to utter publicly, but have been admitting in private for the past 2 years. The program, the bulk collection program, which was exposed in documents leaked by Snowden, is more trouble than it's worth. It's very expensive and very cumbersome, the former official said. It requires the agency to maintain huge databases of all America's landline phone calls, but it doesn't contribute many leads on terrorists. It has helped prevent few, if any, attacks, and it's nowhere near the biggest contributor of information about terrorism that ends up on the president's desks or other senior decision makers. If, after the most significant public debate about balancing surveillance and government in a generation, this is the program the NSA has to give up, they're getting off easy. The bill that passed the House yesterday, called the U.S.A. Freedom Act, doesn't actually suspend the phone record program. Rather, it requires that phone companies, not the NSA, hold on to the records. That bears repeating. At least from the author's perspective of this article, that the U.S.A. Freedom Act doesn't actually suspend the phone records program. Rather, it requires that the phone companies, not the NSA, hold on to the records. Good, let them take them. I'm tired of holding on to this, a current senior U.S. official told Daily Beast. It requires teams of lawyers and auditors to ensure the NSA is complying with Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which authorized the program, as well as the internal regulations on how records can and can't be used. The phone records program has become a political lightning rod, the most controversial of all the classified programs that Snowden exposed. If the NSA can still get access to the records but not have to hold on to themselves, all the better, the senior official said. It's a big win for common sense and for the country, Joel Brenner, the NSA's former Inspector General, told Daily Beast. NSA can get to do what it needs to do with a higher level of scrutiny and a little more trouble, but it can still do what it needs to do. At the same time, the government's not going to hold the bulk metadata of the American people. The NSA is coming out of this unscathed, says the former official. If the U.S.A. Freedom Act passes the Senate, which is not a foregone conclusion, it'll be signed by the president and create a more efficient and comprehensive tool for the NSA. That's because under the current regime, only the logs of landline calls are kept. In the future, the NSA will be able to get the cell phone records from the companies too. That bears repeating. This week, everybody was talking about and saying, we're not getting enough. The people who want more surveillance are like, we're not getting enough. We're only getting the landlines. We're only getting a third of all the records. Here's the allegation. You do the U.S.A. Freedom Act, they're going to get many more records. They're going to have access to all the cell phone records. So the question is, are we going to really have less bulk collection or maybe the same? And there's another irony. This is still according to Shane Harris at the Daily Beast. Before the Snowden leaks, the NSA was already looking for alternatives to storing huge amounts of phone records. One of the ideas officials considered was asking Congress to require phone companies to hang on to that information for several years. The idea died, though, because NSA leaders thought that Congress would never agree. Kind of ironic that the NSA already thought of this idea, didn't think we would be silly enough to do it, and now it's being promoted as the reform, that the reform is going to be what the NSA actually wanted in the first place. Suddenly, the NSA found itself under orders from the White House, this is after the revelations from Snowden, to come up with some alternative to the phone records program that preserved it, but also put more checks on how the records are used. That's when General Keith Alexander, then the agency's director, dusted the old idea off the shelf and promoted it on Capitol Hill. That's right, the U.S.A. Freedom Act, the supposed reining in of the NSA, was literally born from Alexander, the former official said. So maybe the NSA is effectively getting what it wanted, but that doesn't mean privacy advocates get nothing or that they'd count the law passage a loss. There's a large coalition, 50, maybe 100 different groups that have all been in favor of trying to end the bulk coalition, been working together on this. We mentioned the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, the ACLU, FreedomWorks, Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the Constitution Project. Across the spectrum, right and left. The question is on encryption, whether or not the government will be able to break through the encryption that businesses are trying to devise to keep them out. There's an article in the New York Times, so this is from a year and a half ago or so, saying that the NSA is winning its long-running secret war on encryption using supercomputers, technical trickery, court orders, and behind-the-scenes persuasion to undermine the major tools protecting the privacy of everyday communications in the internet age. The agency has circumvented or cracked much of the encryption, or digital scrambling, that guards global commerce and banking systems. For the past decade, the NSA has led an aggressive, multi-pronged effort to break widely used internet encryption technologies, which is described in a 2010 memo describing briefings from the NSA on accomplishments of their employees. I think the encryption thing is a big deal and will continue to be something that is a bone of contention between the tech industry and the government. With regard to what we do in order to protect ourselves from the government, I think that encryption will continue to take off.
Will the senator yield for a question without losing the floor?
Yes, without losing the floor.
Well, I'm so glad to hear my colleague talk about encryption technology, because it is clearly something very important in this privacy debate. And I hear with interest as you cite that article, because one of the key things about the whole encryption debate is several years ago, the federal, those involved at the highest levels of government basically decided that instead of being able to break the encryption code, that maybe it would be a good idea to put an actual government chip in every computer. That was called the Clipper chip. And the notion was that then the NSA and other people wouldn't have to worry about breaking the codes. They would just have a government back door to our technology. And in fact, there were many people, I kept saying, you're going to say instead of Intel inside, you're going to say U.S. government inside every computer? Is that what we were trying to do? So the Clipper chip battle in the 90s was a very famous debate about exactly how we were going to proceed on making sure that we were guaranteeing privacy to U.S. citizens. So clearly, we were successful in defeating the Clipper chip, but it took a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I want to thank my colleague for continuing to fight on these important issues. And you mentioned many of the organizations that were also involved in that battle in making sure. So are you saying that now you believe there's new government efforts to thwart our encryption capabilities?
Well, thank you for that question. I think not only is there's new sort of political rhetoric attacking encryption, but I think there's going to be more efforts. This article's from about a year ago, but I think what's going to happen from this, and what I've been hearing from people, is there's ultimately going to be encryption that's not housed by any company. They're going to have the encryption. The only way you get through the encryption is through the individual. And this is being done because the government's overplayed their hand, and because the government's been such a bully on this. Companies are going to continue to get farther and farther away, and what they're going to do is the encryption will be only in the control of the user. When that happens, the government's not getting into any information at all. So they've taken a tool that probably has been useful to a certain degree, and I don't mind it if we're doing it through warrants and specific suspicion, but I think that they're pushing companies so hard that I think encryption's going to be put in a place where even the company can't get to it.
Ask another question of the senator without him losing the right. This is a debate, as you were just saying. I think I understand your premise is that there are three legs to this stool. There is the federal government who wants access, but they should go through the judiciary system. And there's separately the entities that have the actual records, which is the telecom companies, and that keeping those separates and not blending them, not actually giving the telecom companies the right to keep all the data and information of individuals is a critical distinction. And you were just describing, I think I understood, that in this case, the government was just saying, oh, you just keep all that data and information, which is not exactly what the phone companies had acquired or kept for any business purposes, but it just puts personal data and information at risk. Am I understanding that correct?
I think I understand the question, but I think that, you know, the phone companies aren't excited about it, but they will do it if they're paid and told to do it, basically. But the phone companies, I don't know. I don't know that how much objection they've had to the current system and the new system. They probably don't want to have to hold all this. And there are rumors that the people who want more will require them to. I don't think under the current USA freedom they're going to be required to hold the records, but they're going to be encouraged to and paid to hold the records. But I think the real question is the USA freedom an improvement, or are we just going to have bulk collection by another name done with the phone companies holding the records? That's what my fear is.
Well, I would say to the senator, or ask the senator, in this debate, I think you are raising an important question, if I understand it correctly, is just how much is the U.S. government going to spy on U.S. citizens? And that, combined with the question that you're asking about the changes to the Patriot Act and accumulation of business records, is when that individual can be a U.S. citizen. And, for example, you and I could be somewhere, and you could be a individual of interest to one of these federal agencies, but just because I happen to have a cup of coffee with you, now all of a sudden my business records, all my personal information could be under investigation by the U.S. government, and I wouldn't even know about it. Is that the senator's understanding?
Yeah, I think that's a big concern, and there's a couple things that I think are alarming, that even 2 domestic emails could be routed through a server in another country, and they could be using that to actually get access to 2 Americans that are communicating from New Jersey to South Carolina. But also, I think, as Senator Wyden's pointed out, it's often, or sometimes, sounds like we're targeting a foreigner simply to get access to an American. Do you have a question in that vein?
I think my colleague was asking very good questions, and my intention to rejoin here in a few minutes, but I think it's important, and I would be interested in your reaction, that people understand what's at stake here. We're talking about Section 702 of the FISA Act, and that involves a very important issue of making sure when there's somebody dangerous overseas that we can, in effect, go up on that person to get that kind of information that we have to have. But what we are seeing increasingly, and we have actually put it on our website, we are seeing increasingly Americans are being swept up in those searches, and their emails are being read. And what is especially troubling to me, and I'd be interested in my colleagues' views with respect to this backdoor search loophole, this is a problem today. But it is only going to be a growing problem in the days ahead, because increasingly communication systems around the globe are merging. They are becoming integrated. It's not as if communication systems just stop at a nation's borders. So I think this is a particularly important issue. As we have talked about the amendments that we are interested in offering, I think this is a particularly important bipartisan effort. I don't think people have known a whole lot about how the backdoor search loophole takes place. We've supported Section 702 because when there are dangerous threats overseas, we want our government to be able to ensure it's taking the steps to protect the American people. But having more and more Americans swept up in these searches, particularly with the changing nature of communication systems being integrated, strikes me as a very big problem. And I am going to be back to rejoin my colleague here very shortly, but I would be very interested in my colleague's thoughts on the importance of closing this backdoor search loophole. We've tried in the past. I think that now, particularly when we've had a chance to walk this through in terms of what it really means, my hope is we can finally close it. What would my colleague's reaction be with respect to the importance of this?
No, I think it's a great question, and some are saying that through the back door of using 702, that if there was 90,000 people targeted last year through using this 702, that we collected the information on 900,000 individuals that were incidental and were not the target at all. So for every 1 bit of data that we're collecting on somebody, we're collecting 9 bits of data on somebody who's not the target, but that becomes part of this enormous data center that we're building, and many of those people are Americans that we're getting through the back door. But it's also why I'm here today, is I want the leadership to agree to allow us to have our amendments. That is one of our amendments, and that is a joint amendment that we've worked on. We've been working on these things for months. This only comes up every 3 years. Shouldn't they not give us a day to have a vote on some of these amendments?
I thank my colleague. I'm going to be back to rejoin him in a few minutes. I do so appreciate my colleague's stamina and passion on this. I went to school on a basketball scholarship, and I like to think I've been able to stay in a little bit of shape, but my friend from Kentucky has sure shown both his commitment and his stamina, and I'm going to have to take a brief meeting on another one of the issues that is pending, but I intend to rejoin my colleague here before long, and I thank him, and we'll have additional questions at that time. And I return the floor to Senator Paul.
Thank you for that question. In the New York Times in March of 2014, Claire Miller writes about some of just the costs on U.S. tech companies that are occurring from some of this. Microsoft has lost customers, including the government of Brazil. IBM is spending more than $1 billion to build data centers overseas to reassure foreign customers that their information is safe from the prying eyes of the United States. Tech companies abroad, from Europe to South America, say they are gaining customers that are shunning U.S. providers, suspicious because of the revelations of Snowden that tied these providers to the NSA's vast surveillance program. The estimates are in the billions of dollars lost to American companies. Even as Washington grapples with the diplomatic and political fallout of Mr. Snowden's leaks, the more urgent issue, companies and analysts say, is economic. Tech executives, including Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, raised the issue when they went to the White House to discuss this with the president. It's impossible to see how the full economic ramifications of the spying disclosures, in part because most companies are locked in multi-year contracts. But the pieces are beginning to add up as businesses question the trustworthiness of American technology products. The confirmation hearing last week for the new NSA chief, the video appearance of Mr. Snowden at a tech conference in Texas, and the drip of new details about government spying have kept attention focused on an issue that many tech executives hoped would go away. Despite the tech companies' assertions that they provide information on their customers only when required under law and not knowingly through a back door, the perception that they enabled the spying program has lingered. It's clear to every single tech company that this is affecting their bottom line, said Daniel Castro, a senior analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, who predicted that the United States cloud computing industry would lose $35 billion by 2016. Forrester Research, a tech research firm, said the losses could be as high as $180 billion, or 25% of industry revenue, based on the size of the cloud computing, web hosting, and outsourcing markets in the worst cases, for damages. The business effect of the disclosures about the NSA is felt most in the daily conversations between tech companies with products to pitch and their wary customers. The topic of surveillance, which rarely came up before, is now the new normal in these conversations, one tech company executive put it. We're hearing from customers, especially global enterprise customers, that they're more than ever about where their content is stored and how it is used and secured, said John Frank, deputy counsel at Microsoft, which has been publicizing that it allows customers to store their data in Microsoft centers in certain countries. Isn't that sad? Isn't it sad that a great American company is having to advertise that they're storing their information in other countries because in America, we're not protecting your privacy? Isn't that sad that a great American company, in order to stay in business, is having to advertise to their customers that we're keeping your information in another country? At the same time, Mr. Castro said, companies say they believe the federal government is only making a bad situation worse. Most of the companies in this space are very frustrated because there hasn't been any kind of response that's made it so they can go back to their customers and say, see, this is what's different now. You can trust us. In some cases, that has meant foregoing potential revenues. Though it's hard to quantify missed opportunities, American businesses are being left off some requests for proposals from foreign customers that previously would have included them, says James Staten, a cloud computing analyst at Forrester, who has read clients' requests for proposals. There are German companies, Mr. Staten said, explicitly not inviting certain American companies to join. He added, it's like, well, the very best vendor to do this is IBM, and you didn't invite them. The result has been a boon for foreign companies. Runbox, a Norwegian email service that markets itself as an alternative to American services like Gmail, says it does not comply with foreign court orders seeking personal information, reported a 34% annual increase in customers after the news of the NSA surveillance. Brazil and the European Union, which had used American undersea cables for intercontinental communication last month, decided to build their own cables between Brazil and Portugal and gave the contract to Brazilian and Spanish companies. Brazil also announced plans to abandon Microsoft Outlook for its own email system that uses Brazilian data centers. Anybody still think this bulk collection's a good idea for America? Mark Baranechea, chief executive of OpenText, Canada's largest software company, said that an anti-American attitude took root after the passage of the Patriot Act, the counterterrorism law passed after 9/11 that expanded powers. This is all coming from New York Times article by Claire Miller from March of 2014. But he says that the volume of the discussion has risen significantly post-Snowden, For instance, after the NSA surveillance was revealed, one of OpenText's clients, a global steel manufacturer based in Britain, demanded that its data not cross U.S. borders. Issues like privacy are more important than finding the cheapest price, said Matthias Kunitsch, a German software executive who spurned U.S. cloud computing providers for Deutsche Telekom. Because of Snowden, our customers have the perception that American companies have connections to the NSA. Security analysts say that ultimately the fallout from the revelations could mimic what happened to u.s.a, the Chinese technology and telecommunications company, which was forced to abandon major acquisitions and contracts when American lawmakers claimed that the company's products contained a backdoor for the People's Liberation of China, even though this claim was never definitively verified. Silicon Valley companies have complained to government officials that federal actions are hurting American technology businesses. But companies fall silent when it comes to specifics about economic harm, whether to avoid frightening shareholders or because it is too early to produce concrete evidence. The companies need to keep the priority on the government to do something about it, but they don't have the evidence to go to the government and say billions of dollars are not coming to this country, Mr. Statton said. Some American companies say that the business hit has been minor at most. John Chambers of Cisco said in an interview that NSA disclosures had not affected Cisco's sales in a major way. Although deals in Europe and Asia have been slower to close, he said, they are still being completed, an experience echoed by other companies. Security analysts say tech companies have collectively spent millions and possibly billions of dollars adding state-of-the-art encryption features to consumer services like Google Search and Microsoft Outlook, and to the cables that link data centers at Google, Yahoo, and other companies. IBM said in January that it would spend $1.2 billion to build 15 new data centers, including in London, Hong Kong, Sydney, Australia, to lure foreign customers that are sensitive about the location of their data. Isn't it sad that companies want to avoid being in America? They want to avoid having their information cross our borders. Salesforce.com announced similar plans this month. Germany and Brazil, where it was revealed that the NSA spied on government leaders, have been particularly adversarial towards American companies and the government. Lawmakers, including in Germany, are considering legislation that would make it costly or even technically impossible for government tech companies to operate inside their borders. Yet some government officials say laws like this could have a motive other than protecting privacy. Shutting out American companies means more business for the local companies, Richard Clark, a former White House terrorism advisor, said. This is an article that was published on NPR's website. It's, as Congress haggles over Patriot Act, we answer 6 basic questions. A key section of the Patriot Act, the part of the law that the White House uses to conduct mass surveillance or bulk surveillance, the call records of Americans, is going to expire in a few days. That leaves legislators with a big decision to make. Rewrite the statute to outlaw or modify the practice, or extend the statute and let the NSA continue with bulk collection. I think it'll be interesting to see how the debate ultimately plays out. You have what's been passed in the House. The u.s.a. Freedom Act's been passed in the House overwhelmingly. The majority probably here believes that that we're not collecting enough bulk data. They would prefer to collect more bulk phone data and aren't too concerned that any privacy interests are being trampled upon. So you have two sort of contrary opinions and wondering which direction we go. Some who want more collection of data, say we're not collecting enough data, say they might live with it if we add in and force the phone companies to keep the data. Right now, the bill doesn't have them keeping the data, but the concern for some of those of us who believe in privacy are that we may just be trading one form of bulk collection for another, that we may be trading a system where the government collects the data and there's a bulk collection for a system where the phone companies have the bulk collection, but you're still having the same sort of collection of data. My concern with the u.s.a. Freedom Act is that it still, I believe, may allow for a non-specific warrant. It still may allow for bulk collection in the sense that it says that you have to select a specific person, but the specific person can be a corporation. And so if you're still having a corporation, the problem is if we put the name Verizon in again, and you're getting all of Verizon's customers, and the only difference is that the phone company's holding the information and divulging it versus the government holding it, I'm not so sure we've had so much of an improvement. Some will say we just need to be safe. We just need to do whatever it takes. Doesn't matter if we give up, any kind of basic freedoms or privacy in the process. But I think we give up on who we are as a people if we say that we're going to basically at all costs, that regardless of what it takes, we're going to do this to keep ourselves safe. The thing is even the President's Privacy Commission, though, the President's Review Commission, two independent bodies, nonpartisan bodies, all ended up saying that they didn't think anybody was independently captured, that there was no unique information that was actually gotten from either of these programs, that the bulk collection of data hasn't made us safer, but it has infringed upon our privacy. I think that if we don't have a significant debate on this, if we continue to say, well, we're up against a deadline, that because there's a deadline, we don't have time for amendments, I think we run a real risk, I think, with the American people. Congress has about a 10% approval rating right now. And the thing is that some argue that might be a little bit high, considering how great a job we're doing. 10% approval rating. The vast majority of the American people think we've gone too far in the bulk collection of records. ACLU survey that we looked at a little bit earlier, between the ages of 19 and 39, over 80% of people in that age group think that we've gone too far and that we're not protecting privacy. We just listened to the article from the New York Times where they talk about what kind of business is potentially being lost because people don't want American products. I think it's kind of sad. They don't even want, not only they don't want their data held in a center in our country, they don't want their data crossing our country. I don't think we have to be that fearful of terrorism that we have to give up who we are in the process. I've met some of our young soldiers who've come back who are missing limbs. I've met the parents of some who have died. And to a person, they say that they were fighting for the Bill of Rights. They were fighting for our Constitution. And I guess it's difficult for me to understand how we can take into account their sacrifice, that they've sacrificed in war. At the same time, while we're here safe at home, we can't even protect the documents they're fighting for. I see no reason why we couldn't rely on the Constitution. I see no reason why we couldn't rely on traditional warrants. Warrants are not hard to get. Warrants are actually quite easy to get, and warrants are, if anything, very easy to get. On the FISA court, turning down a warrant is almost non-existent. So I see no reason why we couldn't try using the Constitution for a while. I am concerned, though, that the problem is bigger than just what we're talking about today. We're talking about the bulk collection of records, supposedly under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. If we stop that, how much have we stopped? How much is still in existence? How much are we still doing through other venues? I think probably the most alarming thing that we've come across as I've been talking today is the idea that some people believe that the president has inherent powers that are not subject to Congress. That to me is very alarming. It also means that because this, I think, opinion persists within the executive branch, that there are in all likelihood many programs like the bulk collection of data, many programs that we don't know about, some that we've heard about. It's still not clear to me whether the Stellar Wind program is completely gone, which involves more than just telephone data, email, conversations, computer addresses, credit cards. What is the government collecting? How much is being collected and under what authority? But it does concern me that there are people who believe, some of them elected officials, who believe in the inherent powers of the presidency that cannot be challenged even by Congress. We've got a lot of work if that's really what we're up against. I think that it'd be a big step forward if we do something about the bulk collection of data. But I think given the court case, it's concerning to me that we might actually make the court case or the future of it moot, and that we actually could make things worse. And it wouldn't be the first time that we made things worse, thinking we were fixing things and made it worse. From the opinion of the Second Court, here are some quotes. The court writes, "The telephone metadata do not directly reveal the content of telephone calls. The fact that they do not directly reveal the content of telephone calls, however, does not vitiate privacy concerns arising out of the government's bulk collection of such data. The startling amount of detailed information metadata can reveal information that could traditionally only be obtained by examining the content." And this, I think, is a good point because, you know, many people want to downplay what metadata is or what you can determine from it. But here's the court acknowledging that you may actually get more detailed information from metadata than what you once got from the obtaining of content. And when you think about it, how true this is, think about, you know, if someone were just going to come in your house and take your papers, what can they find? You know, how many people even have personal letters anymore? People don't have anything that's on paper that's personal at all. You might have some bills. A lot of people have their bills online anymore. But it's amazing that if you put the compilation of all the metadata together, what you can determine. Remember that a high-ranking intelligence official said that we kill people based on metadata. I presume he's talking about foreigners. But the thing is that if we're killing people based on metadata, the assumption is that they can get an enormous amount of information from metadata. And we should be very careful about releasing this. They give an example of sort of metadata and what you might determine. For example, a call to a single-purpose telephone number, such as a hotline, might reveal that an individual is a victim of domestic violence or rape, a veteran, suffering from an addiction of one type or another, contemplating suicide, or reporting a crime, all just simply from metadata: who they called, how long they spoke. Metadata can reveal civil, political, or religious affiliations. They can also reveal an individual's social status or whether he or she is involved in intimate relationships. This is still from the court case, the more metadata government collects and analyzes, furthermore, the greater the capacity such metadata to reveal ever more private and previously unascertainable information. So that's sort of the interesting thing also about metadata is we have so much online and so much information on our phone that you could probably be in someone's house for a month and never find that in paper because we have so much that of our life revolves through phone and through things we order and phone calls and all of that, that in the old days, you know, what could have been gotten through someone's castle, through someone's actual papers in their house, I think pales in comparison to what you can get simply through metadata, even without content. They make another point, too. Finally, as appellants point out, in today's technological world, it is virtually impossible for an ordinary citizen to avoid creating metadata about himself or herself on a regular basis simply by conducting his ordinary affairs. The order thus requires Verizon to produce call detail records every day on all telephone calls made through its systems or using its service where one or both ends of the phone call are located in the United States. To me, it's hard for me to believe that there aren't people who don't understand that what we're talking about here is a general warrant. This is what we fought the revolution over. This is the, as John Adams said, the spark that led to the revolution. The spark that led to the revolution was the whole worry and concern, one, that soldiers were writing the warrants, and the other concern was that in writing the warrants, they weren't specific to anyone. They were being written in a general fashion, and that by writing them generally so, there could be an injustice in having an entire group that ends up being subject to a warrant that's not specific. From the appellate court, we also hear that the metadata has a far reach beyond almost imagination.